1. He will begin in the furthest corner of your basement. If you see him, do not overreact. He may decide to move on. 2. If the intruder decides to stay, he will take one step closer each week. 3. Do not attempt to speak with him, hurt him, or get third parties involved. 4. Any violation of Rule 3 generally results in several quick steps forward, depending on severity of transgression. 5. Barricading the doors is acceptable. This will slow him down, but the process will be very loud and difficult to sleep. 6. To others, the intruder will appear as a mannequin or a rubber dummy or a coat hanger, etc. Do not let guests near him. 7. The intruder will not move so long as you have guests in the house, guests who actually want to be there. Once I had an old friend sleep on the couch for 3 months and the intruder didn't move a step. 8. You can leave the house, but never sleep anywhere else. Never make plans to move, even browsing for houses online. The importance of this rule cannot be overstated. General note: none of these rules are set in stone. The intruder seems to evolve and react depending on your actions. Personally, I recommend measuring the distance from him to the farthest corner of your house. Calculate how long it will take him to reach you. Set up your bedroom as far away as possible. Once established, do not move your bed. You must sleep there from now on. Please note that sometimes he will leave his station and wander up into the house. Do your best to ignore him. He will always return to the last place he left off. I had to laugh as I read the typo-ridden list of absurd rules left on my doorstep, conjured up by some neighborhood kid with too much free time. Props for the creativity, though. Stepping back inside, I folded up the note and tucked it away. Guess it was preferable to getting toilet papered. I crossed the room, slumped onto the couch, and resumed watching the game. I just moved into the neighborhood. Owning a house of my own had been a life's goal since 18. Now, after 15 years of working, saving, and taking on crippling debt, I finally had a place of my own. A killer deal on a modest 1980 two-story with a basement and a backyard swimming pool. The main floor was an open design, kitchen, living room, and an entrance hallway that led to the upstairs. Upstairs was a short alcove with 3 doors, master bedroom, guest room, and washroom. The house was the only thing in my lonely life. I felt proud. Something caught the corner of my eye. Across the living room, in the front entrance hallway, the basement door was cracked open. A slit of pitch dark. Okay. I turned back to the TV. Probably forgot to close it earlier. Shaking it off, I focused on the game as much as I could. But the cracked open door lurked in my peripheral all the while. It felt like someone was watching me. Shit. I got up from the couch, marched across the room, pulled the door shut, and marched back. Embarrassed, I plopped into the couch and swung my feet up on the coffee table. Maybe that note was getting to me after all. Maybe whoever wrote it wasn't done messing with me yet. I almost jumped at the pounding on my front door. Muting the TV, I begrudgingly got up and hauled over and yanked open the door. A smiling man greeted me, barely 5 foot tall, round, and wearing a bright green Hawaiian t-shirt with matching cargo shorts. Vaguely reminded me of the Batman's penguin. "Sir," he said, a forced smile plastered to his face. "Hello," I replied. "I'm so sorry to bother you." He looked down at my shoes, studying. "Someone's been leaving notes on the doorsteps out here, and since you're new..." He looked up, glanced back over his shoulder, then back to me. "I just wanted to warn you." This guy had more nervous energy than a cold turkey drug addict. "Warn me about what?" I asked. The smile on his face turned grim. "The notes," he said, pausing for effect. "There's He searched for words. "There's a mentally unstable young man in the neighborhood." Okay. His father, he glanced back over his shoulder again. His father lived in the house across the street from you. An overgrown one-story box of a house. It almost looked abandoned. When his father passed, the son, he looked back to me, started writing notes, leaving them on doorsteps around the neighborhood. I set my hand on the pocket where I'd tucked away the note. The son, if you see him, he's harmless, and the notes, well, of course they're nonsense. He chuckled. I pulled the note out from my pocket. Yeah, I was wondering, I said, carefully unfolding the paper. The man's eyes filled with concern. Rule 1, I read aloud. He will... Please... He stammered. I raised an eyebrow. I've read enough of those for a while, he said, rubbing his forehead with the back of his thumb. They're harmless, but also kind of... He looked around, again searching for words. Creepy? I said. His eyes lit up. Yeah, creepy. What a great word. Creepy. He marveled, weirdly impressed. I almost laughed. Anyways, he continued, I just wanted to let you know, don't worry about the notes. They're ridiculous, of course. Of course, I said. Well, I best be, For the third time, he searched for words. Leaving? I said. Yeah. He laughed and wagged a finger at me. I must say, you're really good with words. He shook his head like I just pulled off a magic trick. I try, I said skeptically, though he seemed sincere. Howie, by the way. He shot his hand out for a handshake. I recoiled. The pandemic was still in full swing. Oh, of course, he said, reading the room. He shook his head again. Still not used to it. It's all good. I'm Brandon, by the way. Brandon. He smiled again and turned away. I stood there in the doorway, watching him leave, dumbfounded by the strange, almost funny conversation. As he stepped onto the road, I stepped back into my house, went to pull the door shut, and stopped short. Something caught the corner of my eye. About 7 houses down, a white hatchback car with tinted windows, idling. I can't say why it grabbed my attention, but it did. For some reason, it felt out of place. Shrugging, I stepped back inside and pulled the door shut behind me. I crossed the living room and collapsed onto the couch. Shit. My team was losing. When the game finished, it was dark out. 3-1 against me, of course. I turned off the TV and stretched up my arms and pushed off the couch. And I froze. The basement door was open again. Wide open. A few long seconds crept up until I finally stepped forward. I know I shut that door. I stopped at the top of the stairs. Below me, everything faded into uninviting darkness. I flicked down the light, and an orange glow started to life. Beige cream walls and a scratchy carpet. The stairs went down about 20 steps, then took a hard turn to the left. I'd only been in the basement twice since moving. Nothing but unopened cardboard boxes down there. I pulled the door shut and went up to my room. Crawling into bed, I flicked off the light and closed my eyes. Maybe the door was broken. A bump in the night startled me awake. I checked the time, 2:58 a.m. Faint moonlight cast in through the bedroom window. Unopened moving boxes crowded my room like a cardboard metropolis. The night was silent. Still half asleep, I sat up onto the edge of my bed, staring at the closet door. A door that reminded me of my childhood bedroom. A door that reminded me of my only childhood friend, Zach. A sliding door with fake cherry wood vinyl covering and Something moved downstairs. 7 quick thumps creaked across hardwood floor, clicking, almost like dog feet, only heavier. I cursed under my breath, fully awake now. The reasonable part of my mind wondered if a raccoon snuck inside. The less reasonable part of my mind wondered if it was Satan himself. I stood up from the bed and marched over to a stack of boxes in the corner. No way I was going down there without a weapon. Sliding a box off the top of a precarious tower, I turned back and placed it on the bed, rifling through it until my hand grasped a familiar cold metal object. I pulled out a chrome-plated switchblade. I flicked the knife in and out a couple times. This'll do. Knife in my back pocket, I stepped towards the doorway, wrapping my grip around the smooth brass doorknob, and pushed it open. It was darker out here, no windows. I flicked on the light. Cold waiting room glow cast over everything. The basement door was still closed, thank God. I crept silently down the stairs, one step at a time. A faint smell hung in the air, almost like burnt hair and gasoline. Almost. Moonlight cast in through the living room window. Everything down here was quiet and still, too still, like the world was on pause. I scanned the living room. Empty. I stepped into the kitchen. Empty. Shaking my head, I pulled open the fridge. Old houses make strange sounds, I reminded myself, pouring a glass of milk. I took a swig. The taste of foul rot filled my mouth. I spewed and spat back into the cup. What the hell? Rinsing out my mouth with tap water, I gurgled and spat until the bitter taste was gone. There's no way that expired already. I checked the date. 6 days till expiry. I set it down and wandered over to the living room window. Across the street, the neighbor's house was dark. I should have asked Howie if the note-leaving son still lived there. Based on what he said, it sounded like the kid needed professional help. Suddenly, a light snapped on. Exterior, left side of the house. Motion detector. It revealed a cluttered and neglected backyard, even more unkempt than the front. Moss flapped in desperate circles over the unnatural glow. The light went dark. Huh? I turned back to head upstairs, but stopped. My eyes caught the basement door again, still closed, but something stirred within me this time, morbid curiosity, perhaps. I trudged over and pulled open the door. I flicked on the light and stepped forward. Scratchy carpet clawed at the soles of my socks. I reached the stairwell corner. More darkness. A 15-foot hallway with doors on either side led to an open rec room. I flicked the next light switch. Nothing. Of course. I stood there for a good 10 seconds, staring into the dark, the strange pull of curiosity only getting stronger. Begrudgingly, I pulled out my phone, turned the light on, and moved forward, stepping over boxes and clutter as I went. The strange smell from upstairs was even more pungent down here. That same gasoline and burnt hair. Maybe there was a leak. I'd get that checked out tomorrow. Regardless, I pushed forward and stepped into the garage-sized rec room. Cold concrete against my feet, I scanned the phone light from left to right until I froze. Stood in the back right corner was a coat rack post. For a second, it almost looked like a person. I don't own any coat racks. Somebody put it there. I felt sick, angry. Somebody broke into my house and put a coat rack in my basement corner. Indignant, I marched forward, yanked it off the ground, and stormed back upstairs. I knew exactly who did it, too. The same person who left the note. Had to be. That was disturbing enough in its own right, supernatural bullshit or not. Of course, back then, the possibility of the note being a sincere warning never crossed my mind. I didn't even consider the chance that something unknown and terrible was about to enter my life and never leave. At this point, I was convinced that a malicious trickster was trying to break my sanity. I'm not the most stable of individuals, but it'd take more than a coat rack and creepy note to do that. A lot more. I snapped the coat rack in half, tossed it in the garbage, and sat up in the living room until morning. The next day, I installed new security and locks. If anything else happened, I'd get the police involved. Either way, I'd been through worse. In hindsight, dismissing the note might be the biggest regret of my entire life. I stood at the living room window, waiting. Finally, the garbage truck pulled up to the curb. A heavy-set man in a bright orange vest stepped off the back, spat dryly onto the pavement, and hoisted my garbage into the back compactor. Climbing onto the truck, he unceremoniously tossed the aluminum bucket back onto the road. My relief vanished. Inside the bucket was a left-behind, foot-long splinter, a lingering remnant of the coat rack. Bursting through the front door, I yelled after the garbage truck, and it lurched to a grudging stop. I forced a smile, strode across the yard, bent over, reached into the can, grabbed the splinter of wood, and tossed it into the truck. The man in the vest blinked disinterest as they drove off towards the next house. The truck's compactor pressed down with a satisfying crunch. Goodbye, coat rack. There was a strange comfort in it, as though the coat rack itself held some special power over me, a power which, upon its destruction, had lifted. Strolling back toward the house, I caught myself smiling, almost feeling happy. I wrapped my hand around the front doorknob, and a sharp pain shot up my wrist. My hand swung back like electric shock. Gritting my teeth, I turned my palm around. A splinter, about the size of a blood test needle, was lodged in between my thumb and pointer finger. I breathed in, pinched the splinter, yanked it out, and tossed it back over my shoulder. I stepped inside. I pulled the door shut, and red smeared across the brass knob. I turned my hand over. A thin line of blood trailed out from the puncture hole, snaking down towards the tip of my thumb. I wrapped my other hand around the wound and marched back towards the kitchen. The bandages were in a tray on top of the fridge. I pulled them down and wrapped my hand up. Turning around, I leaned my back against the fridge, marveling at how quick my good mood had soured. All it took was a wooden splinter. But another thought crept into my head. Part of me, the paranoid, irrational part, wanted to go back and find the splinter, take it out past city limits, and burn it. I actually had to fight the urge to go back and do this. It's a coat rack, I reminded myself. Either way, I took comfort in the new security setup. Alarms on every door and window, big stickers advertising the system to any would-be intruders. I even checked every corner of the house just to be sure nobody was hiding inside. Despite everything, I still hadn't fully processed the fact that somebody took the time and effort to sneak into my house and set a coat rack in the basement corner. Not steal anything, not even move anything. Just set a coat rack in the basement corner. This simple fact stuck in the back of my head like a stubborn popcorn shell stuck between teeth. Hunched over my laptop at the kitchen table, I took a sip of bitter black coffee. Thanks to the pandemic, all work was homework now. That was fine by me. I preferred staying at home to just about everything else anyways. Typing away, I was finally falling into that ever-elusive Zen state of work, coding line after line until my phone buzzed against the plastic vinyl tabletop. Unknown caller. I reached over and froze. Something told me not to answer it. Something told me to block the number, but I shook it off and answered regardless. "Brandon," said the voice on the other end. I couldn't tell if it was a question or a statement. "Speaking." "I'm calling about the note," he continued. "The one on your doorstep." He sounded young, early 20s maybe. "Okay," I said. "Yeah, I was the one who left it there." I didn't respond. I didn't know how to respond. "Look, I know it's weird. Trust me, I know better than most. The thing here is to make sure you understand what's going on, to make sure you take it seriously. Does that make sense?" I didn't answer. He sighed, anxious. "I know you think I'm crazy. Shit, I might be. I just need to talk with you in person. Don't call this number again," I said plainly, and ended the call. I set the phone down, leaned back in my chair, and crossed my arms. In hindsight, I regret my coldness here, but in my defense, I'd seen enough real-life horror by then. I was pushing 40 and well acquainted to the crushing mundanity of real-life suffering. I had no desire to indulge in made-up nonsense. There was another knock on my door. My heart skipped a beat as the pounding at the front door continued. I slid back on my chair and stood up. Fists clenched, I marched across the room and yanked open the door. There stood a young man, tall and dressed in a white shirt and black denim pants. "Look, I'm really sorry to be this persistent, but..." Immediately, I recognized his voice from the phone call, but I had to admit his appearance was surprising. Until now, I imagined a weaselly-looking, basement-dwelling internet troll, but this guy almost looked like a low-key movie star, young Marlon Brando vibes. Regardless, I didn't know what to say. He looked down, kicking his feet awkwardly at the ground. He looked up. "I just need 5 minutes," he said. "I can explain everything and never come back." His eyes were filled with sincerity, years of suffering hidden beneath a desperate smile. I looked around. Other neighbors were milling about. A few glanced over, concerned. I looked back to him. "Fine," I said, my voice dripping with skepticism. He looked back over his shoulder, then back to me. "We can't talk here. Let's go for a walk, if that's all right." "Okay." I consider myself a pretty good judge of character, and he didn't seem dangerous. He seemed worried. If anything, my curiosity was driving now. Early evening overcast gray fell over the suburbs. We walked down the street, side by side, 6 feet apart, silent. Our shoes scraped against concrete. The smell of outdoor barbecue lingered in the air. He looked back over his shoulder. We were about 4 houses down from mine. "First off," he said, looking forward again, "I want to apologize." He slid his hands into pockets as he walked. "I don't really know the best way to approach something like this, and I'm sorry for being so cryptic." I grunted non-committally. "Second, I really don't expect you to believe me," he continued. "Unless I saw something firsthand, I wouldn't believe me either." He looked up at the clouds and squinted as diffuse sunlight cast against his face. The sky was spitting rain now, invisible drops you only felt, sporadic icy pinpoints against the skin. "Maybe I'm crazy. I don't know." He shrugged. "My dad was. At least that's what we all thought when he finally..." He trailed off into silence. "Anyways, I'm getting off track. He ran a hand through his jet black hair. "Just take it seriously for the first couple weeks and see where it goes. If it's bullshit, it's bullshit." I still wasn't quite sure what to say. At this point, I believed that he believed. But that wasn't enough to change my entire worldview. "All you can do is search for ways to slow him down. Invite people over as much as possible. Try to figure out if there's a way to stop him without breaking the established rules," he continued. "I know there's the pandemic, but hell, invite a stranger over if you have to. Rent free." "Who's living in your father's house?" I asked with directness that surprised even me. I don't know." "You don't know?" He shrugged again. "I haven't been there since." Trailing off into silence, he grimaced, looking around as if the words might be somewhere close. "I grew up here," he said, changing the topic again. "My sister and I used to collect pine cones in the park." He pointed across the street. Park was a generous word for an empty lot with a couple trees and a bench. "We'd sell them to the neighbors," he said, almost smiling. "Pine cones, 5 cents apiece." He shook his head like a chill went down his spine. "Look, you've got to take the rules seriously," he said, shifting back to the previous topic. I still wasn't convinced. "You don't know who's living in your dad's house," I persisted. "Did you sell it?" He stopped walking and turned to face me. "Don't try to understand this," he said, rubbing his forehead with the back of his thumb. "The more you try to make sense of it, the more you try to rationalize, it only gets worse." It sounded like a death cult mantra to me. "Sure," I said. "You have my number, right?" I nodded. "If anything happens, you have any more questions, call me. Anytime. Seriously, anytime. 4 a.m. if you have to. I don't care." "Okay." "It's Mitchell, by the way." He gave a little wave, turned away, and strolled off down the street, leaving me even more confused than before. Worse than that, I was beginning to consider the possibility that this might actually be real. A possibility made all the more disturbing due to the fact I'd broken nearly every single rule. His sincerity was unsettling. By the time I got back home, it was dark out. I stood at the front door, rifling for my keys, when "Brandon!" a familiar voice called out from behind. I turned back to see Howie standing on the curb. I almost didn't recognize him at first. He wore a blue tracksuit with a blue pencil tucked behind his ear and blue headphones wrapped around his neck. This guy really likes blue. "Howie?" I said. "Carver's kid spoke with you, huh?" He rested his hands on his hips. I nodded. "What'd he say?" I shrugged. Same stuff as the note. Howie shook his head as if to say, I expected as much. "Poor kid," he said. "At least he'll stop bugging you now." "Yeah." Just then, beside the house across the street, the outdoor motion light snapped on. Odd. Howie looked back to see what I was seeing. Through the cracks in the fence, a lined silhouette stood up against the boards. It was hard to tell from this distance, but it almost looked like somebody stood there, watching us, peering through the fence cracks. But the yard was filled with junk, so it could have been anything. Howie turned back to me. "Anyways," he said, pulling up his headphones and turning away. "Who's living there now?" Howie froze, lowered the headphones, and turned back. "Not sure," he said. So they never sold it?
Nope, not to my knowledge.
So, it's empty.
I've seen someone, maybe a few someones milling about inside.
Ever seen them outside? Howie tilted his head, thinking. He clearly never paid much attention to it.
I don't think so,
he said.
But I got a goldfish memory.
He chuckled, shrugged, reached to put his headphones back on, and...
Oh!
His face lit up.
I've been stuck on this.
He pulled a crumpled piece of paper out from his jumpsuit pocket and read,
"A thin piece of metal which glows brightly when a current passes through."
He looked up at me, eyes filled with hope.
8 words across, first letter F, third letter L.
The light across the street snapped off, and a light inside snapped on. Window blind shadows cast from inside as someone moved across the living room.
Brandon?
Filament, I said, eyes still locked on the house across the street. Howie scribbled away.
That's it. My God, that's it.
He sounded like he just won $1,000. He looked up at me.
You're brilliant.
I looked back to Howie, glad to help.
Anyways,
said Howie, his enthusiasm suddenly gone.
See you around.
He pulled his headphones up and jogged away. I stood there, watching the house across the street. The light inside was still on, but no more movement. I turned back to my door and stepped inside. Pulling the door shut behind me, I strode into the living room and stood at the window. The house across the street was dark again. I pulled the curtains shut and turned back for the kitchen. The strange smell of gasoline and burnt hair lingered in the air still, subtle, but unmistakable. I flicked on the kitchen light and sat down at the table and stared blankly at the wall. Harsh fluorescent glow vibrated against white stucco. I should get warmer light bulbs. Another thought crawled into my head, a thought that was slithering around in my subconscious for the past few minutes. Mitchell, the dead neighbor's son, did not put the coat rack in your basement. Of course, it's possible he did, but after talking with him, it seemed highly unlikely. This raised another, even worse question. Who put the coat rack in the basement? Howie? Doubtful. Another neighbor? Possibly. The person or persons living across the... There was a click as the sound of a door popping open interrupted my thoughts. I looked back over my shoulder. Across the living room, in the front entrance hallway, the basement door was open. Just a crack, a thin line of darkness. Screw it. I marched upstairs, grabbed my switchblade from the bedside table, and stormed back down, each footstep heavier than the last. Knife clenched in my left fist, I swung open the basement door and flicked on the light. "I'm armed," I said, trying and failing to sound like a threat. "If anyone's down there, make yourself known now." Silence. Nothing but the hum of a buzzing light bulb. I took a deep breath and exhaled. "Okay," I whispered, taking a slow step forward. I used to mock people in horror movies for going down into the basement, but in the moment, it weirdly felt like my best option. It was that, or leave the house or try to sleep, knowing it's possible that someone's hiding in the basement. Call the cops, tell them I found a coat rack. Most cops don't even have the time to worry about stolen cars, let alone misplaced furniture. None of these choices were appealing. I reached the first stairwell and stopped at the first corner. Somehow, the hallway seemed darker than before. I flicked the light switch, warm glow cast over all. The light wasn't working last time. I stepped forward, the familiar smell of burnt hair and gasoline getting stronger. The short walk down the hallway, feeling like eternity. Finally, I stepped into the rec room. Both corners were empty. I breathed relief and felt blood rush into my face. Once again, embarrassed at my own paranoia, I pocketed the switchblade and turned back when something caught my eye. In the far right corner, behind a stack of cardboard boxes, water. A thin layer of surface tension slowly spreading across the shiny concrete. Shit. They never said anything about leaks when I bought the place. I crossed the room and squat down. There were scattered clumps of wet dirt, too. No obvious source for the leak. Strange. The circle of water slowly expanded outward. I stared into it, and my crystal clear reflection stared back. I need a haircut. My face rippled as a single drop fell from above. Of course. I looked up. Nothing but pink insulation and 2x4 beams up there. Could be a faulty pipe, I thought. Might explain the weird smells, too. A door slammed shut. Upstairs around the corner, the basement door slammed shut. I jumped to my feet and whipped out the switchblade. Before I could process what happened, everything went dark. Pitch dark. The kind of dark that makes everything sound like it's right next to your ear. The kind of dark that makes your thoughts visible. I fumbled for my phone, and it clattered onto the floor. Shit. I dropped to my knees, flailing in the dark, sliding my hands across the cold, smooth concrete, desperately searching for it, searching for the light. The smell of burnt hair growing stronger all the while. No phone. Only concrete and cardboard boxes. Shit. Panic swelled inside my chest like a balloon, threatening to burst right through my rib cage. I froze. I breathed in. I breathed out. I breathed in. I breathed out. The panic stopped growing. It didn't get worse, and it didn't get better. It held in the state of pure survival mode. Clenching my eyes shut, I rose to standing. I didn't even know which direction to go anymore. I followed my gut and took a step forward. Up ahead, 7 quick thumps staggered down the staircase and slammed against the corner wall. Silence. A sliding sound scraped against the drywall as if something rose to standing. A sickening chill went down my spine. My hand clenched tight around the switchblade. "You have about 3 seconds," I said, once again failing to sound like a threat. 3 seconds went by. 5 seconds. 10. Only silence. The sound of my own panicked breath and silence. Screw it. Knife pointing forward, I rushed ahead, screaming my best attempt at a war cry as I flew through the dark. My ankles caught against the first step, and I sailed forward, slamming chin first into the corner stairwell, swiping and flailing the blade like a blind madman all the while. The light snapped on. I squinted as my eyes adjusted to the sudden brightness. Flat on my ass, backed into the corner of the stairwell. There was nobody here. I looked up the stairs. Nothing. I looked down the hallway. I froze. Stood in the center of the rec room, shattered splinters held together with nails and wire. The coat rack. Thus far, I'd broken nearly every single so-called rule. 1. He will begin in the furthest corner of your basement. If you see him, do not overreact. He may decide to move on. I'm guessing that snapping the intruder in half and throwing him into a trash compactor counts as an overreaction. Number 2. If the intruder decides to stay, he will take one step closer each week. Based on my math, I had about 264 days to go until he reached my bedroom. Probably sooner, since he seemed to be moving faster now. 3. Do not attempt to speak with him, hurt him, or get third parties involved. I threw him in a trash compactor. 4. Any violation of Rule 3 generally results in several quick steps forward, depending on severity of transgression. That would explain why he's already in the center of the rec room. 5. Barricading the doors is acceptable. This will slow him down, but the process will be very loud and difficult to sleep. I might do this when the time comes. Earplugs and white noise to sleep over the sound. 6. To others, the intruder will appear as a mannequin or a rubber dummy or a coat hanger, etc. Do not let guests near him. I don't even want to think about this one right now. 7. The intruder will not move forward so long as you have guests in the house, guests who actually want to be there. Once, I had an old friend sleep on the couch for 3 months and the intruder didn't move a step. I have no friends. Not anymore. 8. You can leave the house, but never sleep anywhere else. Never make plans to move, even browsing for houses online. The importance of this rule cannot be understated. Okay, from here on out, I'd follow the rules until I thought of something better. 2 sleepless nights crawled by until I finally built up the courage to go back downstairs. I needed my phone. Down the basement hallway, in the center of the rec room, stood the coat rack. Behind it, my phone lay face down against the concrete floor. I crept forward, averting my eyes all the while. Sliding into the rec room, I pushed my back up against the wall and glanced over at the coat rack. Immediate regret followed from the sight I saw. Nails and wire snaked around mangled shards of wood. If the coat rack was a substitute, then what did the actual intruder look like? An image flashed through my mind, a gaunt man with a carnival smile, held together with nails and wire. I shook it off and leapt forward. Snatching my phone, I scrambled away and hauled up the stairs. The hands of nothing chasing me from behind, reaching for my ankles, ever-stretching arms desperate to pull me back into the dark. I slammed the door shut and pressed my back against it. Breathing heavy, I slid down to the floor. It's a coat rack, I told myself. But the words rang empty now, like parents telling frightened children that there's nothing to be afraid of. There's nothing hiding under the bed. When really, they both know there is. There's always something hiding under your bed. Maybe it's not the long-toothed monster you imagined as a child. Maybe it's a feeling, a hidden thing that you can't accept because you don't even know what it is. So instead, you pretend it doesn't exist. A festering obligation you keep pushing back and back and back, always lurking just out of sight, hiding in your peripherals. Sometimes, you even catch a glimpse of it, only to look and find nothing. So you shrug it off. You turn back to your food, your booze, your... There was knocking at the front door. I got up, slinked over, and pulled it open. There, just as I expected, stood Howie. "Brandon," he said, wearing an oversized smile and an oversized white tee with baggy sweatpants. "Howie," I said, fighting back the pull of sleep deprivation. "Sorry to bother you so early. It's just..." He paused, looking over his shoulder, then back to me.
There's been a few break-ins around the neighborhood last night, and were you hit?
I shook my head. No.
Fortunate,
said Howie. Behind him, in the driveway of the house across the street, sat a red Kawasaki motorcycle, the first and the only time I'd seen a vehicle over there.
Anyways,
said Howie.
See you around.
He turned to leave. Howie. He stopped and turned back. Did you know them? I said, still watching the house across the street.
Mr. Carver? A little,
said Howie.
He ran a restoration thing, fixed up our basement after a flood. A nice man, but quiet.
I nodded. Howie smiled and turned back.
Anyways, be safe out there,
he said, humming to himself as he strolled off. I pulled the door shut and turned back inside. Reaching into my pocket, I took out my phone and dialed. The tone rang out a couple times until... Hello? Mitchell Carver and I met in a diner on the edge of town. A 2010s diner designed to look like a 1950s diner. Every roadside greasy spoon cliche in the book. Movie posters plastered the walls. The front grille of a turquoise Cadillac hung up above the front door. Red leather booths lined up against the windows. I sat there, staring blankly outside. Across the highway sat abandoned middle-class suburbs, foreclosed 12 years back. Traffic droned like swarming flies. Mitchell sat across from me. He wore a leather jacket and a ball cap, and his eyes were quiet and distant. So you don't count as a third party? I asked. Mitchell eyed me, confused. The rules. No third parties, I said. He shook his head. No. Why? Already a believer. Studying him, I took a sip of bitter black coffee. He still seemed sincere, but trustworthy. I wasn't sure. Why does belief matter? I don't really know yet, said Mitchell, leaning back in his seat. He glanced around the diner, almost like he was expecting someone. He turned back to me, suddenly serious. You need to tell me what happened. Excuse me? You said on the phone something changed your mind. I raised an eyebrow. I hadn't told Mitchell about the first coat rack incident for several reasons. Mainly, I didn't want to set him off. For all his sincerity, this guy did not seem like the most stable of individuals. Not that I blamed him, considering his life circumstance. Why are you helping me? I said, changing the topic. He looked out the window, his eyes flicking back and forth as traffic sped by. He turned back to me. I killed my dad, he said. I mean, not literally, but it's my fault he died. He weighed over his next words carefully, the traffic outside slowly droning ever louder, like a rising tide. Mitchell continued. The last few years of his life, nobody believed him. We all thought he was crazy, but he never talked about it straight up. He just left notes. Sometimes you'd be home after a visit and find one tucked away in your shoe. Mitchell cleared his throat. The notes were always about the person hiding in his house, how they were trying to literally terrify my dad to death. The front door chimed open. Mitchell tensed up and glanced back over his shoulder. A family of 4 shuffled inside. He relaxed and turned back to me. I just want to make sure what happened to him doesn't happen to anyone else. He leaned back in his seat again, hands wrapped tight around a cup of untouched coffee. Fair enough.
Look, said Mitchell, if you broke the rules once, even twice, that's fine. But you need to tell me what happened.
I nodded slowly, took a deep breath, and I snapped the coat rack in half, threw it in a trash compactor. Mitch's eyes filled with shock, a shock he immediately repressed, like a doctor trying to act cool in front of a patient with horrific test results.
And it came back the next day.
Yeah, held together by nails and wire. Mitchell nodded.
How much farther ahead was it?
The front door chimed open again, but he didn't look back. About 10 steps from the corner, I said. Mitchell nodded, again acting like it was all good when it clearly wasn't. Another question dawned on me. Why does it look like a coat rack? Mitchell shrugged.
None of the rules are set in stone. Did you buy the place with your own money?
Yeah. Well, sort of. Mortgage.
Yeah, that shouldn't...
Mitch? A voice from behind cut into the conversation. An older man, wearing a brown leather jacket and carrying a red bike helmet. Tall, wiry, and in need of a shave. Clint Eastwood vibes.
Mitch, where have you been?
He said, his voice strained with sadness. Mitch looked away, acting like he wasn't even there.
Mitch,
he said again, his voice shaking now. I turned back. Mitch stared down at the coffee in his hands. His reflection rippled in waves of highway traffic rumble. His eyes were wet.
Mitch, please,
the man said, leaning forward slightly.
I've been looking everywhere for...
The stranger trailed off into silence and stepped back. He looked at me. His eyes were filled with years of suffering. He reached into his coat pocket, produced a card, and placed it face down on the table. He looked back at Mitch one last time.
I'm always here, kid.
He smiled grimly, then turned away and wandered back towards the exit. Hands on the door, he stopped and looked towards us. He opened his mouth to say something, but he turned away, pushed outside, and stepped down into the gravel parking lot. He crossed the lot and climbed onto a red Kawasaki motorcycle. He looked back at me through the window, his eyes different now, apathetic. Suddenly, his eyes lit up, darted back and forth for a few seconds, then snapped back to vacant apathy, almost like someone had crawled into his mind, taken a quick look around, and jumped back out. He pulled on his helmet and revved up the engine and sped off.
Mitch?
I said, still staring out the window, the realization of who that was finally dawning on me.
It's not him,
said Mitch.
Not anymore.
I turned back. Mitch, hands shaking, took a sip from his coffee and set it down.
You wanted to know what happens when it reaches you.
He threw up his hand as if to say, wish granted. I didn't fully understand what he meant by that, but right now wasn't the time to push. Mitch looked, on the verge of tears. Reaching across the table, he grabbed the card and handed it to me. I already knew what it said, but I turned it over and read anyways. Carver Restoration and Renovation. Owner, P.T. Carver. Rule number 6. To others, the intruder will appear as a mannequin or a rubber dummy or a coat hanger, etc. Do not let guests near him. What exactly does others mean? Mitchell left the diner shortly after his dad showed up, but before he left, I asked him about being the so-called other. He just shrugged and said again, rules aren't set in stone. The meeting revealed almost nothing, save for more unsettling questions. Why was his dad still alive? Why was his dad's bike parked in the driveway across the street? Was that even his dad? Was Mitchell messing with me? Was the entity messing with both of us? Questions over questions over questions. Rising dread lurked beneath the surface of it all, like reality itself were a blanket draped over some unspeakable terror, a veil that might be torn away at any second. Highway 7 was emptier than usual. My blue 1993 Toyota hatchback reverberated with the drones of rubber against road. The red sun crept down behind the distant mountains. Shadows stretched longer as the day crawled westward. Against pastel pink skies, starling flocks moved like a singular hive mind. Driving always calmed me down. Before I owned a car, I used to go for these long, solitary hikes out in the temperate mountain rainforest. There's something about constant motion, outside, alone and peaceful. I was still committed to following the rules, at least until I thought of something better. My next priority would be to get somebody over, a guest who actually wanted to stay. Maybe I'd rent out the spare bedroom, maybe I'd call up an old friend. Easier said than done, especially considering the pandemic. Either way, I needed to get a handle on this. Up ahead, parked at the side of the highway, the red Kawasaki motorcycle. I sped past before the image fully registered. Letting off the gas, I checked the rear view mirror. There it was, the red bike about 200 feet back. I pulled over. Only the bike was there. I shifted into reverse and froze, breathed in and exhaled. I shifted back into forward and stared at the empty highway ahead, pinned straight to the horizon. Just go home, I thought, but I didn't listen. I shifted back into reverse and headed towards the red Kawasaki. Lurching to a stop, about 10 feet away, I stepped outside, squinting as rising plumes of dust stung into my eyes. There sat the bike, kickstand out, keys still in the ignition, helmet sat on the driver's seat. I'm no mechanic, but the air smelt like engine trouble. I glanced around. The highway shoulder went out for about 20 feet, then cut down into grassy fields. About 50 feet down, someone sat down on the edge of the shoulder. Mitch's dad, P.T. Carver. At least that's what I assumed from this distance. He sat with elbows resting on knees, staring off into the field, smoking. I stood there, weighing my options, wanting to leave, but letting my curiosity win yet again. I walked over, the smell of gasoline getting stronger with every step. A red jerry can sat on the hard-packed dirt beside him. I stopped about 10 feet away. He glanced over, made eye contact, nodded, and turned back to the view. Car troubles? I asked. Bike troubles. Anything I can help with? Nope. He took a drag off his brown cigarillo, vanilla flavored, judging by the smell. All my questions backed away. Sympathy replaced curiosity. Apparition or not, this man looked broken down, as though his life had been nothing but letdown after letdown after letdown. He studied something out in the distant fields. I turned to see what he was seeing. Nothing. Shimmering wind rippling through the flood grass. The last drips of daylight soaking back into the ground. He pointed. Off past the boardwalk, he said. About 200 feet. My eyes followed his directions. Still nothing. Beside the water, he said. Then I saw it. 3 bears, brown bears, a mother and 2 cubs drinking from the water. I'd never seen a bear outside of zoos. I didn't even know they lived around here. Probably came down from the Bowery, he said. Clear-cut suburbs up there now. He spat dryly and pressed his heel against the spit and turned his ankle like putting out a cigarette. Just then, the mother bear looked up and glanced around as if she'd heard something. She held there for a couple moments, then went back to drinking. "So you're friends with my son?" he said, watching the bears all the while. "No, not really." "Boyfriend?" "No. Nothing wrong with that. Didn't say there was." He smiled grimly, clenched his eyes shut, and took a long, slow drag off the cigarillo. "Acquaintances," I said. "What's that?" "Acquaintances. You know, people who know each other tangentially." He nodded. "You moved in across the street, right?" "Yeah." "Ignore the crazies." "Crazies? Neighborhood's full of them," he said. "Crazies catching." "Yeah, I meant to ask about..." He raised a hand. "Not right now," he said. "You come by tomorrow. I'll answer any questions you want about any of that. Just not right now." He motioned toward the horizon, as if it were the only moment of peace he'd seen in years. I nodded. He smiled warmly, took one last drag, and pressed the cigarillo down against the hard-packed dirt beside him, twisting it there until it went cold. Wiping ash-stained fingers onto his brown leather jacket, he took a deep breath, exhaled, and pushed up to standing. He produced another cigarillo and offered it to me. I shook my head. "I just quit." He shrugged, lit up, took a drag, and exhaled more vanilla-flavored smoke. "You know what to do when you run into Balu," he said. "Balu?" Again, he blinked disappointed surprise. "Grizzly. Up close." I shrugged. "Throw your hands up, make a lot of noise, yell?" I said, half remembering something from grade school. He scoffed. "That's a good way to end up with your head viced between bear jaws." Pulling another drag, he exhaled the smoke out through his nostrils. "You run into one up close." He paused for effect. "Just talk to her, like you're doing here. Pretend she's an old friend, long time, been a while. Tell her about your day, ask her how she's been." His cold blue eyes filled with memories, drifting back and forth across the distant horizon as he spoke. "All the while, you keep backing up, slow-like, slow as you can manage. Not slow like you're trying to leave, slow like, huh? We both happen to be going in the same direction." He looked directly at me. "Know the difference?" I nodded. He turned back. 9 times out of 10, she'll follow. Curious. You just keep backing up, keep talking." His jaw tensed up and then relaxed. "When you got about 15, 20 feet between you, take off your backpack or your hat, whatever." He looked down at the dirt. "Place that on the ground. She'll stop to see what that's all about, sniffing, prodding. You back up faster now, but not by much." Again, he looked directly at me. "The trick is to accept the fate that you're scared shitless. Accept that your head's lying to you, begging you to run. Whisper in every song in the Bible, you can do this, you can fight, you can run." He waved his hand as if to say, and so on. "You let that fear take control." He snapped his fingers with surprising loudness. "That's it." He looked away, flicked his cigarillo straight down, stomped it out, and spat. "Instead, you tell yourself, 'Damn, I am really scared right now.' You take that and whatever else,
and you set it aside. Don't push it away. Don't forget it. Just set it aside and focus on breathing instead. Focus on backing up, one foot after another. No shortcuts." He trailed off into silence. "Soon enough, she'll lose interest and wander off." He met my eyes again. "Usually," he continued, "if Balo wants a fight, you go for the eyes." He shrugged. "At least you go down fighting." A few long seconds passed until I realized he was finished. "Thank you," I said, not really sure what else to say. I turned back to the field. The family of bears was gone now. He chuckled softly and stepped back. "Look, you have any questions about any of this haunting bullshit?" He met my eyes. "You know where I live. Just come over." I nodded, still not sure if he was a puppet, apparition, real, or some combination of the three. "I'll just tell you straight up, don't take anything the neighbors say seriously, especially that damn Howie." "Sure," I said, turning back for my car. "One more thing." He squat down, picked up the red jerry can, and shook it. Empty. The nearest gas pump was about 3 miles out. I brought the jerry can back full, and we drove home the same direction. Despite my reservations, I liked PT. He reminded me of my old man, rest in peace. Still, I didn't know who to believe, and I couldn't shake the way his eyes moved outside the diner. Maybe I was paranoid. Maybe I was seeing things. But no amount of paranoia explained the coat rack in the basement, which, first thing tomorrow morning, is what I meant to ask him about. I pulled up into my driveway and sat there a good moment before stepping out. Orange streetlights bounced over wet asphalt. Frantic moths swarmed the unnatural glow like flies to a corpse. A small gray dot of a cat or raccoon shimmied down a neighbor's fence and slinked across the fresh-cut lawn. The house across the street was dark, and the driveway was empty. Maybe he took a different route back. I stepped inside and pulled the door shut behind me. When I saw the basement door, the weight of everything suddenly came crashing back. The door was shut, yet almost pleaded with me to open it, silently begging me to check and see if the coat rack was still there, see how much farther along it was. Turning away, I went for the kitchen, but I stopped in the living room and looked back over my shoulder. Screw it, may as well get this over with. I spun around, marched over, yanked the door open, and flicked on the light. Taking a deep, slow breath, I stepped forward, one step at a time, and my foot slipped. I tripped forward 7 quick steps and tumbled over head first into the corner. Throbbing pain shot up my left leg. My shin was snapped, turned left at a 90-degree angle. The bone inside pushed up against my skin like a swollen cyst, and I almost puked at the sight. Thankfully, I was in too much shock to fully appreciate the rising pain. "Shit," I hissed, gritting my teeth and pushing back into the corner as the long dark hallway stretched out before me. I couldn't stand. I couldn't even reach the second light. I could barely think. I gritted my teeth and clenched my eyes shut. Breathe in, breathe out. Breathe in, breathe out. The adrenaline pushed me into a strange state of calm. I opened my eyes. Everything was slightly brighter now as my vision adjusted. Nothing but shadow. I pulled out my phone, turned up the screen to maximum brightness, and shone it down into the hallway. The coat rack was still there, but closer now, stood in the entrance of the rec room. Now, a heavy wool coat hung from its top. About 5 feet closer, I guessed. So much for 1 step a week. I tucked my phone away and turned back towards the exit, carefully shifting my body weight to avoid more pain, a tedious process. I couldn't afford paramedics or an ambulance, so I'd have to crawl up the stairs. Of course. A solitary drop of water fell somewhere in the darkness. The coat rack's dim silhouette stood motionless. I'm not sticking around for this, I thought. I was about to turn away, but something moved. Behind the coat rack, something rose to standing. I only saw the shadowed outline of a person and the faintest hint of pinkish red skin, like the skin of a dying pig. I froze, paralyzed. My eyes adjusted bit by bit. The wool coat shook as 2 gaunt yet unnaturally large hands emerged from the dark and wrapped around the coat rack. Gripping tight, the hands lifted the coat rack noiselessly off the ground. Silence. A quick step forward. A shuddering exhale, as though it took great effort. Then it set back down. More silence. Then the coat rack hoisted upwards again, and another quick step forward. The schlick sound of wet, bare feet pressed on and off the concrete floor. Another strained exhale, and they set it down. There was an almost hypnotizing, percussive rhythm to it all. Again, the coat rack hoisted up, and I'd seen more than enough. Twisting to my side, I clawed my hands onto the banister and hoisted myself upward, wincing in pain as my snapped leg drug uselessly behind me. More footsteps, more stuttering breaths. It was moving faster now, getting closer. I pulled myself forward, 1 tedious thrust at a time, gritting my teeth through the rising pain. Shit! Whoever was holding the coat rack was on the stairs now. I didn't look back. I couldn't look back. I kept pulling forward, inching closer and closer to escape. All the while, a terrible image projecting in my head. The image of long, ever-stretching arms with pig-colored skin sliding up the stairs, reaching for my shins, inching closer and closer until I gripped the doorframe with both hands and launched myself forward. Lurching into the upstairs, I spun around and kicked the door with my good leg. It slammed shut with satisfying finality. Catching my breath, I listened for the slightest movement below. Seconds went by. Minutes. Nothing. My racing thoughts finally steadied. Time to barricade the door. Leg in a blue cast, I hobbled across the street on crutches. 49 hours had passed since I fell down the stairs and saw the intruder in the basement. Or, at least, I saw its hands. Regardless, enough was enough. I needed concrete answers and a concrete plan. At this rate, the intruder would reach my room in weeks, maybe days. I pounded on the neighbor's door and stopped. Something inside moved. Through frosted windows, down the hallway, the blurry shadow of a door creaked open. Someone peeked out. I waved politely, but they stepped back into the room and pulled the door shut. I raised my hand again to knock when the front door swung open. There stood P.T. Carver, dressed in blue jeans and a brown shirt, looking even more Clint Eastwood-like than before. "Brandon," he said, smiling warmly. I opened my mouth to respond, but realized I didn't even know his name, just the initials. "Paul's fine," he said, stepping back from the door and motioning me inside. I propped forward onto my crutches and, "Wait." He reached behind the door and produced a box of disposable light blue masks. "You don't mind?" he said, putting a mask on himself and handing another to me. "Of course not," I said, and put the mask on. "Getting too old to risk it, you know?" said Paul, stepping back from the door and once again motioning me inside. As I stepped inside, his eyes dropped to the blue cast around my leg. He raised an eyebrow. "Fell down the stairs," I said. "Ouch." He shut the door and I glanced around the house. The interior contradicted my expectations. Varnished oak walls with a smooth shine. His house felt like an old Wall Street corner office, like in those movies where men in suits pull whiskey out from beneath their desks. There was no upstairs, only the first floor, a couple bedrooms, and a door that led to what I assumed was a basement. A long hallway led to the back of the house, and I noticed the room which someone had peered out from. The door was still shut. The air smelled like tobacco and vanilla. Not a bad smell, at least not to me. Tobacco scent always reminded me of my dad's house back in Georgia, back when I was a kid and still somewhat happy. I kicked off my shoes and pressed my sock-covered feet against the floor. In this oddly fancy house, the carpet was out of place, green, scratchy, worn down to the plywood in some areas. "Please," said Paul, motioning towards the living room. I shuffled deeper into the house. Despite the sunny day outside, it was dark in here. All the blinds pulled shut, everything cast in shadow save for a couple desk lights and beams of intruding sunlight. "Feel free to take a seat," said Paul, nodding towards a long green velvet couch. I slumped down, and immediate relief came over. Hobbling around on crutches was more tiring than it looked. "Can I get you anything? Water? Coffee?" said Paul. "I'm good. Thanks." Paul winced, as though I offended him. "You sure? Water?" No, thank you." Paul sat down on a wooden stool across from me, a stool that creaked with antique strain. Crossing his legs, he leaned sideways against the wall, studying me like a therapist studies a client. "So?" I took a deep breath and exhaled. "Last night, I saw him." Paul's face remained neutral. He shifted his weight slightly. "Saw who?" "The intruder." I leaned forward in my seat. "What I saw has no reasonable hands, barely human." I trailed off into silence. "Did you take a photo?" "No." "Good. Keep it that way." "Why?" He studied me carefully before continuing. "You seen a doctor?" "No." He glanced down at the cast on my leg, then back up at me. I rolled my eyes. "Well, yes." "You tell him about?" "No." His face filled with strange relief, uncrossing his legs. He leaned forward and rested his elbows on his knees. "Do not tell anyone else about this. Not even Mitch. You understand?" "Yeah." Paul leaned back, reached into the chest pocket of his shirt, and pulled out a cigarette. He pulled off his mask and tossed it back over his shoulder. He brought the cigarette up to his mouth, pinched it between his thin lips, and took out a pack of matches. A thump reverberated from somewhere deep inside the house. He froze, raised an eyebrow. Silence. He shrugged, struck the match, and Another thump. Paul shook out the match and tossed it into a tin can sat upon a yellow plastic crate to his left. "Excuse me," he said, stepping up, turning around, and marching deeper into the house. I watched as he rounded the corner and disappeared into the foyer hallway. Now I was starting to wonder if coming over here was such a good idea to begin with. My initial meeting with Paul was surprising to say the least. His long, drawn-out bear safety monologue was odd, but endearing in a weird sort of way. But when Paul showed up at the diner, Mitch seemed truly disturbed, like he'd seen a ghost. Either way, I just wanted answers. Hopefully Paul would give me that. Right then, there was the sound of the door clicking open in the foyer hallway and then clicking shut. The faintest hint of a smell entered my nostrils, the recurring smell of gasoline and burnt hair. So subtle, it might have been imagined. Down the hallways, muffled voices. Arguing? I tilted my head and strained to listen, but "Sorry about that," said Paul, suddenly stepping into the room. "No worries." With oddly pin-straight posture, Paul sat down on the couch across from me. A brown velvet couch with old-time drawings of farms and ducks that reminded me of a sofa at my grandma's house, the same one I slept on after Grandpa's funeral. "You want answers, huh?" said Paul, striking a match, lighting up the cigarette, and finally taking a slow, satisfied drag. The smoke lingered around him for a moment, then slowly drifted back towards the dining room. "Why does Mitch think you're dead?" Paul nodded, as though expecting the question. Reaching over the side of the couch, he tapped the cigarette with his pointer finger. Small bits of glowing ash broke off and tumbled down into the tin can. "Back when Mitch and Rachel, his sister, were kids," said Paul, "I had some serious health issues. Still do, full disclosure, but I'm medicated now and that helps." He lifted the cigarette to take another drag, but stopped short. Remembering something, he lowered it and continued. "After my father passed away, I started to believe something was stalking me, toying with me." He shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Started with small things at first, bumps in the night, food gone bad before the expiry date. Things too small to talk about, but too big to just, brush off." He met my eyes, then looked away and took another short drag off the cigarette. I thought back to the expired milk in my fridge, one of many unanswered questions still festering in the back of my mind. Paul sighed. "I'm a rationalist at heart, so the possibility of something unnatural." He waved his fingers like a magician. "That never crossed my thoughts." He paused again, glancing over at me, judging my reactions as he spoke. "Now, bear with me, 'cause all this leads to a point," he continued. "One night, back in 94, maybe 93, the kids and their mom were fast asleep. It was Thursday, so I went down to the basement for canned peaches and a late-night beer." He pointed down at the floor. "The light wasn't working, so I came back with a flashlight and—" He trailed off into silence, his cold blue eyes still locked on the floor. "This time, someone was down there, just standing there, stood down the basement hallway with their back turned to me. I wanted to call out, scream, run upstairs, get my 9mm, but instead I just froze, like roadkill in headlights." Paul looked directly at me. "That's when it hit me. I realized that this intruder, over 7 foot tall by the way, he was halfway stuck into the concrete wall, like the mold set around him and dried there. Paul shook his head, like a chill went down his spine. I couldn't even think straight. He leaned forward and rubbed his forehead with the back of his thumb, a weird tick that suddenly stuck out to me. Mitch did the same thing, and so did Howie. Things got really bad after that. The more I tried to fight it, the worse it got. The more I tried to make sense of things. He trailed off into a moment of silence. Of course, nobody else saw him. They just saw a stack of cardboard boxes. He paused again, looking around the room. One night, cold, autumn night, I downed 2 bottles of cognac and brought my 9mm downstairs. Marched straight up to him. He made a gun with his fingers and pointed at me. Pressed the barrel between his dead eyes and pulled the trigger. He mimed the motion of gun kickback and limply dropped his hand back onto his thigh. But he didn't even flinch. Bullet went straight through him, ricocheted off the back wall, and got me in the hand. He held up his left hand. The pinky finger was cut off short at the first knuckle. I hadn't even noticed until now. He shook his hand like it went numb and leaned back into his seat again. After that, Holly threatened to leave, take the kids with her. He rubbed the side of his palm against his left forearm, ruminating. Then his eyes suddenly lit up, as if remembering something. Let me show you something, he said, pushing up from the couch. He strolled towards the door I assumed led to the basement. I remained seated. After my last encounter with the intruder, I wasn't a big fan of stairs or basements. You coming? Paul, noticing my hesitation, looked back at me the same way my dad used to, struggling to hide disappointment. I cleared my throat, grabbed my crutches, and pushed to standing. Paul smiled a half smile, pulled another disposable mask out from his back pocket, and put it on. Standing in front of the basement door, he pulled a ring of keys out from his front pocket. Humming to himself, he rifled through until finding the key he wanted. He unlatched the chosen key and turned the lock. No dice. He relatched the key and went back to rifling, still humming all the while. Meanwhile, I stood back about 10 feet, eyes locked on the mysterious room at the end of the hallway. The door was shut. You live alone? Yes, said Paul. Well, yes, and no. He unlatched another key and gave that one a try. No dice. An old friend lives in the room down the hall. I'm the caretaker, sort of, he said nonchalantly. That's good of you. Yeah, well, I owe them one, said Paul. I considered asking more, asking if they were a guest keeping the intruder at bay, but something told me to keep it to myself. Paul huffed, unlatching a third key from the ring, holding it up to his face. He studied it like a jeweler studies a suspect diamond. He brought it down to the lock, pushed it in, and turned. Finally, the door clicked open. Third time's the... Paul looked around, searching for words, the same way Howie did. Shaking his head, Paul tucked away the key and stepped down into the dark. He flicked the light on, and cold fluorescent glow stammered to life. Concrete walls and wooden steps smothered in layers of dust. Paul looked back over his shoulder. You good with stairs? He said, looking down at my cast-covered leg. I'll try. He nodded. Use the railing. He turned back and stepped deeper into the basement. I hobbled across the hallway and stood at the top of the stairs. Peering down, the flight of steps seemed longer than expected, like it went down 1.5 stories instead of just one. Paul stood at the bottom, another door in front of him. Though maybe door wasn't quite the right word, more like a bunker hatch, metallic and held shut with an arm-sized lever instead of a doorknob. I didn't want to go into the basement, but the weight of morbid curiosity compelled me yet again. Paul gripped his hands around the lever, braced himself against the wall, and pulled. His wiry arms flexed and strained as the lever slowly lurched towards him. Gritting his teeth, Paul yanked harder and harder until finally the lever gave way, swung backward suddenly. The metallic door itself shifted downward with an echoing clang, and clouds of dust particles burst out from the edges. Paul wiped his forehead with the back of his arm, squatted down, and grabbed the bottom of the door with both hands, hoisting upward. He pushed the door into a vertical swing. It pressed flat up against the ceiling. There was nothing but darkness ahead. Paul crept forward, and silence followed. 5 long seconds ticked by until a light flicked on. More cold, stuttering glow. "You good?" Paul's voice echoed up the staircase. Yeah, I'm okay," I said, and stepped forward, once again being dragged by the magnetic pull of morbid curiosity. Going downstairs on crutches was even more tedious than expected. The whole precarious journey took about 3 minutes until, finally, I stepped into the basement. A long, narrow hallway led to a 2-way fork in the path. Dirt floors, plywood walls. "I've got an engineering/construction background," said Paul, strolling forward. "Built this place from the ground up." He stopped at the fork in the hallway and looked both ways, thinking. He looked left. He looked right. He looked left again. He shrugged. "Gotta be this way." He pushed forward, and I followed. "Basement's bigger than you'd think," he said as we rounded the corner. Another narrow hallway led about 20 feet ahead until it reached another 2-way fork. Paul kept walking, and I kept following. I put up these walls, trying to build a maze around him. To slow him down, he chuckled, rounding another corner. "Then I put up the bunker hatch and—" He trailed off into silence, rounding yet another corner. We entered a 10-foot by 10-foot room. He stepped into the middle and turned back to face me. "This, my friend, is the construction of a former madman," he said playfully, looking around. "Holly left me halfways into me building it." He shook his head and spat at the ground. "I don't blame her." He looked directly at me. "Look, kid." He paused. "You want all this to go away. You want to stop having these encounters. Work on yourself." I blinked. "Are you kidding me?" Half shrugging, he continued. "Look, I know how it sounds, but after Holly took the kids and left, it really kicked me into gear. I stopped drinking, got help, professional help. Started taking meds, the right meds. And sure enough, all this went away. No more man in the basement. No more altered reality bullshit. I know it's the last thing you want to hear, but this thing, it's all in your mind. You don't think it's a little odd that my hallucinations match yours?" Paul nodded understandingly. "What do you think set all this off?" I shook my head. "The note," said Paul. "The note, my son, well-meaning though he was, left on your doorstep." I just wanted to leave now. I was tired. "You ever heard of Tulpa?" said Paul, reaching forward and placing his hand onto my shoulder. I didn't respond. I just stood there, staring at him blankly, leaning forward on my crutches. "Tulpas," Paul continued, "are these things that don't exist until you believe they exist. The more you believe they exist, the more they do. And the more they exist, the more they screw with you." If I wasn't so tired, I would have laughed. "Okay. Look, I'm not saying that's what this is, but it might be what this is." "Sure." "Mitch, bless him, he still thinks it's all real. Thinks it got to me years back. Thinks it's controlling me now. Using me to trick others into worshiping it or something." He smiled grimly. "It's a different story every time." Paul shook his head. "All I can say is, it's not real, but the only way to stop it is to figure out what's wrong with your life and fix that." Something moved upstairs. 3 quick, staggering footsteps. Paul glanced up at the ceiling, then back down to me. "Ignore the intruder and follow the rules until you've fixed your life, or until you stop believing it. Then you take that coat rack out past city limits and you douse it in gasoline and you burn it. Okay?" "Okay," I said non-committally. Finally, he pulled his hand off my shoulder. "You need help with anything, I'm always here. You got booze problems, life problems, anything," he said, his eyes filled with sincerity. "This thing, it really messes with your head, makes it hard to know who you can trust, you know? Sometimes it feels like it's almost jumping in and out of people around you, controlling them. But it's all in your head." His tone was shifting now, almost sounding excited. Part of me wondered if the intruder was controlling him right now, deriving twisted pleasure out of messing with me. I shook off the thought, and another thump upstairs. Paul acted like he didn't hear it. "I should go," I said, stepping backward. "Sure, kid," said Paul, again talking to me like I was his son. I turned around, and as fast as I could without tripping, I crutched my way out of the basement maze, up the stairs, and out of the front door. I stepped out of Paul's house and took a deep breath of fresh air. It felt like getting rescued from a drowning river. I exhaled relief. At this point, I didn't trust Paul or Mitch or even Howie, for that matter. Nothing was stable, and everything was getting worse. I hobbled back across the street, and my phone buzzed to life in front of my pocket. I stopped in the middle of the road, pulled out the phone, and flicked on the screen. Squinting, I held it up to my face. 27 missed calls from Mitch Carver. Of course. Rule 7. The intruder will not move so long as you have guests in the house, guests who actually want to be there. Coat rack. "Where are you?" said Mitch, sounding like he hadn't slept in days. "Home," I said, rifling through a box of tools. My phone, set to speaker, sat on the garage floor. "You didn't see my calls." "Yeah, my bad. Service out here." "Look, Brandon," he cleared his throat, "I need you to be 100% honest. Did you speak with the neighbor?" "Yes." A long, draining silence followed, and then click. Mitch ended the call. Shaking my head, I went back to searching for tools. Right now, I didn't have the time to worry about Mitch. First, I needed to barricade the basement door. Second, I needed to call every single person in my contact list and offer them the spare bedroom rent-free. Digging through the tangled mess of tools, my hand finally gripped around a familiar, smooth wooden handle. Out from the box, I pulled a hammer. Bingo. Resting on a single crutch, I stood at the basement door, pounding nail after nail into scraps of 2x4s and whatever else I could find. Unlike Paul, I didn't have the resources or the knowledge to build an apocalyptic bunker door. This makeshift zombie defense would have to do for now. Hammering away faster and faster, I once again fell into a strange calm, a meditative peace that filled every breath with purpose, and my hand slipped. The hammer slammed into my pointer finger, and throbbing pain shot up my arm. Cursing through my teeth, I clenched my hand tight. The hammer fell to the floor and dented headfirst into the hardwood. Idiot! Idiot! Stupid idiot! My thoughts exploded into a tirade of self-abusive screaming. A few seconds went by, and the pain numbed. My thoughts cleared. I took in 3 slow breaths and squatted down to pick up the hammer. I froze. Through the bottom crack of the door, the basement light was on. I honestly couldn't remember if I turned it off or not, but the light being on didn't bother me. Not anymore. Not after everything I'd seen. What bothered me was the dark shadow standing on the other side of the door, flanked by orange glow. That, and the sound of breathing. Barely audible, but unmistakable. Labored, strained, and rattling like an empty bottle of spray paint. Suddenly, the door pushed forward slightly, as if hands pressed against the other side. Breathing deep, I gripped my hand around the hammer and rose to standing. Leaning forward, I turned my head and pressed my ear flat against the door, listening. The intruder was whispering. "Stupid idiot," he gasped, quick and stuttering. "Stupid idiot." Labored breathing continued all the while, almost as if it were 2 separate voices. He was repeating my earlier thoughts aloud, right down to every random intrusion. "Dent in the floor, dent in the floor, lights on, turn them off." The whispering continued. "Is that breathing? I think breathing. House, coat rack, basement, dent in the floor, dent." I'd heard enough. I stepped back, shook my hand out, lined up another nail, and hammered away. "It's not real," I told myself. "It's all inside of your head." Finally, I slammed the last nail into the last board. I took 4 steps back and marveled at the ramshackle creation. It wasn't pretty, but it got the job done. My eyes flicked involuntarily to the bottom of the door. The light was off now, and the whispering had stopped. Wiping my forehead, I turned back towards the living room and slumped down onto the couch. I took out my phone and pulled open my contact list. Time to find a willing guest. 2 hours later, dialing number after number, straight to voicemail after straight to voicemail, and not a single bite. Coat rack. Only one person actually answered, a roommate from college. "I'd be more than down," he said, "but I'm up in Canada now." Of course. Maybe I'd have to put up with an ad on Craigslist. I tucked my phone away, just about ready to give up, when I heard 3 small knocks at the front door. I had a pretty good idea of who it was. Pushing up from the couch, I grabbed my crutches, marched across the room, and pulled open the door. "Hey, Brandon." There stood Howie, dressed in a red sweater, red jeans, and a green backpack, looking a little less chipper than usual. "Hey, Howie," I said, trying my best to act normal, despite the fact a living nightmare stood mere feet away. Howie, despite all his quirks, was a sight for sore eyes. Sure, I didn't trust him, but at least he wasn't Mitch or Paul. "Yeah, so this is kind of awkward, but I'm wondering if I could crash here for a couple of days," he said. "I can sleep on the couch, pay rent, whatever. No worries if not." He shrugged. I looked back over my shoulder, then back to Howie. Sure." Immediately, he pushed past me, strolled across the room, threw his backpack on the floor, plopped down onto the living room couch, and kicked up his feet. "What's with the door?" he said, pointing at the barricaded basement door. Pulling the front door shut, I stepped forward. It's an art project," I lied. "Replacing the door frame, anyways." "Huh?" said Howie, clearly not buying it. "The Carver kid been bothering you still?" "No," I lied again. "No man in the basement corner yet?" said Howie, chuckling. I forced a half-hearted laugh. "Ha ha ha, nope." "That's good," said Howie, turning back to the TV. "Where's the remote?" Howie's sudden arrival was suspiciously convenient at best and outright malicious at worst. But right now, I didn't have time to think about that. If the rules held, his being here would at least buy me some time to figure out how to stop all this. Maybe I'd sell the house. Maybe I'd defer ownership back to the bank. But judging by the no third parties rule, I doubted either of those would actually work. So far, the only people who knew about the intruder were Mitch and his father. And according to Mitch, he didn't count as third party because he already believed. But Paul, his father, that part was getting to me. Something was missing. Paul's whole fix your life, fix your problems spiel bothered me, but something else bothered me more, and I didn't know what it was. Like that feeling you get when you're about to leave home and you know you've left something important behind, like a nagging itch in the back of your head. I offered Howie the spare room, but he preferred the couch. I didn't fight him on it. I wanted to keep him here as long as possible. I didn't even ask why he needed to stay. It was kind of nice to not be alone in the house for once. At 9:30, Howie fell asleep watching Jeopardy reruns. I muted the television and went upstairs. Tomorrow, I'd plan my next steps, but right now, I needed to sleep. I climbed into bed and flicked the lights off. A bump in the night snapped me awake. A heavy thud like somebody hit their fist against a wall. I climbed out of bed and, hopping on one leg, pulled on a dirty t-shirt and a pair of jeans. I tucked my chrome switchblade into my back pocket. Another thud from downstairs, heavier than the first. What was Howie going to say about this? I grabbed my crutches, carefully moved down the stairs, and peered into the living room. The blue glow of muted television cast over the room. Howie was still fast asleep on the couch. Thump. The basement door shook this time, like somebody slammed their forehead against it. I backstepped away, deeper into the living room. Howie was out like a rock. Heavy sleeper. Thump. Okay. I told myself to breathe, remember the rules, Barricading the door will slow him down, but it'll be loud. That's all this was. I'll put in some earplugs and blast white noise and fall asleep. Turning back towards the kitchen, I stepped across the room as quiet as possible. Last thing I wanted was for Howie to wake up and start asking more questions. Thump. This time the hardwood floor shook beneath my feet. I froze. My eyes drifted back to Howie, still asleep, his face motionless, almost serene. I turned back for the kitchen. Either Howie was the world's heaviest sleeper, or he couldn't hear the sounds at all. Stepping into the kitchen, Brandon? A small, muffled voice called out from behind the door. I looked back over my shoulder, towards the basement door. Brandon, the voice repeated, slightly deeper now. I turned around and faced it head on. Brandon. From behind the basement door, the voice strained, sympathetic and familiar. You okay? The voice repeated my name again and again, each time sounding completely different, like a slot machine shuffling through different tones until it hit the right one. You in there? It was getting familiar now. You okay? Suddenly, the voice shifted into a perfect mimic of my late father, gently knocking, the same way Father did to my bedroom door after Zach, my best and only childhood friend, died. A memory I did my best to ignore, until now. After Zach died, I biked home, sat on my bed and stared blankly at the vinyl closet doors for 6 hours straight, eyes tracing every path of the wood grain pattern again and again. The entire world outside, dissolving into nothing. The starscape painted walls somehow pushing closer and closer. I'm here if you need to talk, kid, my father called out, one last time. For a second, I thought that it was the intruder speaking. For a second, I actually believed it was my dad down there, gently knocking on the basement door. Silence. Lingering silence stretched on for minutes while I just stood there, paralyzed, not breathing, eyes locked on the basement door. Finally, my lungs forced me to gasp in air. Oxygen flooded into my brain, and awareness came rushing back. On the TV, played a silent infomercial about some vegetable blender thing, and Howie was still fast asleep. I shook out my hands, went back into the kitchen, opened the drawer beside the fridge, and pulled out a pair of orange earplugs. It's not real, I told myself again, trying to take Paul's advice. I slid the drawer shut. It's all inside of your head. But again, the words fell flat, like empty platitudes after a funeral. I'm sorry for your loss. I'm sorry for your loss. I'm sorry for your loss. I turned back across the living room and crutched my way onto the stairs. Time to sleep. Brandon? I was halfway up the stairs when a different voice called out from behind the basement door. A teenager's voice, strange yet familiar. I looked back over my shoulder. Brandon, the voice repeated, this time tinged with fear. This time, completely familiar. Long forgotten memories came rushing back. Memories of Zach. Memories I ignored and shoved away because it was easier to pretend they never happened. It was easier to do everything in my power to ignore the dread than to face it head on. It was easier to pretend Zach never even existed. Brandon, help! Zach's voice quivered, terrified. Something's down here, he whispered. Brandon! He pulled at the door handle, and the door shook. Brandon, he whimpered, the fear in his voice growing each time he spoke. Brandon, open the door, please. He pulled at the handle again, harder this time. Brandon, please, open the door. He banged a fist against it. Brandon, I'm sorry. Brandon. His voice trailed off into sobbing whimpers, and he slid down the door. Muffled weeping. An image crawled into my head, the image of Zach, gray hoodie pulled over his head, curled up into a ball, weeping at the top of the basement stairs. Silence. A shrill scream of terror, primal, almost inhuman, followed by the quick thumping sound of a body dragged over stairs, screaming and pleading all the while, drugged downstairs, down the hallway, into the rec room, kicking and screaming and begging. Up from the basement, echoing through a vent in the wall next to my ear, I'm sorry. Another voice, not Zach's voice, not my father's voice, a voice I didn't recognize, panicked and remorseful. I'm sorry, Zach. Zach, I'm so sorry. I can't. I don't. The sickening sound of bone cracked against concrete, like a tree branch snapping in the wind. The percussive beat of skull against stone, again and again and again. Whimpering shrieks for help, turning more unintelligible with every impact. Even worse, the person killing him was profusely and sincerely apologizing all the while. I'm sorry. Oh God, I'm so sorry, Zach. Sudden silence. 5 seconds. Or 5 minutes. I didn't know. Only silence. Silence and then sniffling whimpers. Not Zach's voice. Not my father's voice. The voice of who I assumed was the intruder, crying, almost sobbing. Oh, no, it moaned, filled with unimaginable guilt. Oh, God, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry, it wailed. Then I heard it drop to its knees and fall to its side and maybe curl up into a ball and trail off into pitiful, whimpering sorrow. This went on for several minutes until, finally, more silence. Sniffling, the sound of somebody standing up, the sound of somebody dragging a body against concrete. Deeper and deeper into the basement, quieter and quieter, as if the rec room stretched on further than it should, further and farther away, until nothing. Dazed in a trance, I wandered up the stairs and into my bedroom. I pulled the door shut, stuck my earplugs in, and crawled into bed. I shut my eyes, and a realization flooded over me. Coat rack. Finally, I understood the nagging itch in the back of my head. A realization so obvious, I hated myself for not getting it sooner. I burst into laughter. Not happy laughter, not funny laughter. Insane, compulsive laughter. Curling into a ball on my bed, I turned onto my side and stared at the fake cherry wood vinyl closet doors, the doors that reminded me of my childhood bedroom. My eyes traced along the paths of the wood grain patterns, and the words of Paul played through my head all the while. Take that coat rack out past city limits, douse it in gasoline, and burn it. I told Paul a lot of things, but I never told him about the coat rack. Rule 1. He will begin in the furthest corner of your basement. If you see him, do not overreact. He may decide to move on. I woke to the sound of rain tapping against the bedroom window and snaking downward, a pointless race to the bottom. large drops consuming the smaller. I sat up and stared at the shut closet doors. The horrific sounds of last night still echoed in my head. Reaching for my crutches, I stopped short. Water, a puddle on the windowsill. I grabbed a single crutch, pushed up to standing, and hopped over. Water dripped off the windowsill and onto the floor. I wiped my hand against it. Cloudy white droplets clung to my fingertips. I ran another hand along the edges of the window seam until it caught a snag. More water. The seal was broken. Yet another expense I didn't have the money for. Wiping my hand off on my shirt, I turned back around when another memory entered my head. The dripping sound in the basement. The puddle of water and clumps of wet dirt in the basement corner. What exactly was that about? I grabbed my other crutch and went downstairs. Howie's green backpack sat in the middle of the living room floor. "Howie?" I said. No response. Shrugging, I moved into the kitchen. Maybe he went out for the day. Either way, my curiosity was getting the better of me once again. The barricaded basement door was inviting me down. One last time. I stood there, thinking about puddles and coat racks, ruminating. I never specifically mentioned the coat rack to Paul. Sure, there's a chance he could have overheard me talking with Mitch, but that seemed unlikely. Maybe he really was possessed by the man in the basement. Maybe I really am completely insane. Maybe I'm trapped in a madness triggered by Mitch's note in a misplaced coat rack. But that seemed crazier than the actual situation. Regardless, I needed to investigate the basement. One last time. I couldn't go through the main door, but thankfully one of the spare rooms down there had a window. A small window stuck in a cramped window well, but a window nonetheless. Hopefully, the few extra quarantine pounds wouldn't prevent me from squeezing through. I brought my trusty switchblade and a pencil-sized high-powered flashlight. I'd be going in dark because the light switch was on the stairs, and so was the intruder. I wasn't thrilled at the prospect of going back down, but according to the rules, the intruder wouldn't hurt me. At least that was implied. I crouched down into the gravel window well. Moving around with one leg was getting a little easier, but I still needed crutches. Through the window, I slid my crutches in first, and then my flashlight. Both fell to the carpeted floor inside, a little louder than I'd have liked. Feet first, I pulled myself through and stepped down into the room. A room no bigger than a walk-in closet, crowded with unopened boxes. Squatting down, I picked up my crutches and flashlight. It's not real, I told myself once again, flicking the flashlight's on switch. Nothing. Are you kidding me? I literally changed the batteries 5 minutes ago. I shook the light. I smacked it with the palm of my hand, and it flickered to life. Thank God. I was starting to feel like a Silent Hill character, clunky walking controls included. Flashlight between my teeth, I crouched across the room, deeper into the basement. My hand gripped around the doorknob, and I froze. The insanity of me being down here again suddenly hit me. Was this really such a good idea? I glanced back at the open window, inviting sunlight cast into the room. The peaceful sound of rain patting against gravel. I turned back for the door. I still don't know why, but something told me the water in the basement corner would answer many questions. Filled with bitter resolve, I clenched my fist around the doorknob, turned it, and gently pushed open the door with my knee. Okay. It was quiet down here, like the entire world behind me suddenly vanished into non-existence. I stepped into the hallway, turned to the left. The light between my teeth cast into the distant stairwell corner. Empty. Thank God. I turned to my right. The cold concrete rec room greeted me, uninviting, as always. Even before all this, the rec room creeped me out. There was something about hallways that led to rooms with blind alleys on either side. Anything could be hiding there, waiting to jump out at you as you stepped in. The random stacks of cardboard boxes didn't help either. I crouched forward. Shadows on the rec room's wall lurched up and down with each forward step. My eyes darted back and forth, searching for any possible movement. I stepped into the rec room and swivel-checked the corners. Nothing. Everything motionless. So still, it almost felt like the room was on pause. A thin layer of dust covered all. I crouched forward again, and my cast-covered leg bumped into a stack of precarious boxes. A stack of boxes that collapsed into another stack of boxes and then another one. The tumbling crash of random objects slammed into the concrete floor. I tensed up, bracing for the noise to stop, feeling like a fool of a toque. Finally, the domino cacophony stopped. Silence returned. I looked back over my shoulder, casting light into the stairwell corner. Empty. Good. I half expected something terrible to be stood there. I waited with held breath, waited for the intruder to stagger down the steps, but nothing happened. Not even the sound of breathing. Not even the smell of burnt hair. Okay. I turned around and crept towards the back corner. I squatted down and studied the corner, the same corner where the water had dripped a few nights back. I looked up. Pink insulation and pipes. Maybe it really was just a leak. Maybe I came all the way back down here for no good reason. I was about to stand back up when something caught my eye. Dust, or rather, the lack of dust. A perfectly dustless square in the corner of the concrete wall, about 3 feet by 3 feet. I leaned in close and squinted. There was a hair-thin line in the concrete, a crack only visible from the perfect angle. A thin line forming the shape of a square, like someone had cut into the concrete with a laser. Reflexively, I placed my hand against the dustless square and pushed. The panel shifted backward with a satisfying click, then shifted forward and slid to the side, revealing an entrance barely big enough to crawl through. I looked back over my shoulder, shining the flashlight at the door to the rec room. Still nothing. I turned around and crouched down farther. The entrance led to a tunnel, a long straight tunnel with dirt walls, dirt floors, and strained beams holding it all together. It went for about 20 feet, then took a hard turn to the right, a hard turn directly towards Paul's house. I barely even registered what I saw when the basement light flicked on. My eyes flinched as they reacted to the sudden light, and I spun around. Eyes opened. Still nothing. Time to leave. I pushed up to standing and crouched back towards the hallway. The basement light flicked off again. Screw this. I picked up speed, hauled down the hallway, shoulder pushed back into the spare room, slammed the door shut, and locked it. Taking a deep breath, I stepped away from the door, spun around, and shoved my crutches through the open window. I hoisted myself through and scrambled out of the window well. I crawled away from the window and lay with my back on the wet lawn. Catching my breath, I stared up at gray skies. Suddenly, my phone buzzed to life in my pocket. I pulled it out. One missed call. Unknown number. Voicemail. One message. I tapped into voicemail and held it up to my ear. Hey, Brandon. It's Paul. I'd like to set things straight. Call me back when you get a chance. I haven't been fully transparent with you." No shit. Throughout all this, I kept thinking about my childhood friend Zach. They never found his body. The only thing they found was a green bicycle, mangled, twisted, and stained with blood and guts. Hit and run, according to police. Likely a semi-truck that didn't even know at first. Some driver, driving for miles, oblivious to the mess of gore stuck to the front of his truck, driving all the way to the next brake stop. It's more common than you'd think. The driver probably got spooked, cleaned the gore off his truck, lied to himself, and said it was just a deer or something. And that's that. I never bought it. Back when I still cared, I was convinced something else was at play, something incomprehensibly terrible. It took me over 10 years to finally accept the given explanation. That was the first step to moving on. I finally stopped thinking about Zach every day. Sometimes I didn't think about him for weeks, even months. Up until the intruder's mocking theatrics, I'd barely thought about Zach for years, and that was fine by me. Anything to get a good night's sleep. But now, memories of Zach played through my head like half-remembered dreams. Like the time he jumped from a second-story bedroom window onto his trampoline and his mom screamed at us from the living room. The time we stayed up all night playing Super Mario Bros. When my dog died, and Zach came over, didn't say anything, didn't try to make me feel better. He just sat with me, and that's all I needed. I didn't have a real friend before Zach, and I haven't had one since. I agreed to meet with Paul in a public park. My plan was simple. Let him do the talking. Hopefully learn something along the way. At this point, it didn't make much sense to confront Paul on anything. I'd only bring up the coat rack if needed. I still didn't even know if Paul was Paul, but that didn't matter right now. Gray skies above. Paul sat on a park bench overlooking a duck-filled pond. Reddish-orange autumn leaves carpeted over muddy grass. I approached from behind. "Paul?" He looked back over his shoulder, breathing fog. "Let's go for a walk." We trudged down the gravel path, boots crunching against the gravel. "You know I struggled with booze, right?" said Paul. I nodded. "I told you the first time I saw the intruder was in the basement, yeah? Well, that wasn't entirely accurate. I did see him once before that, way back in '81. Holly and I, not married yet, were camping out in Utah, LaSalle Mountains." He stopped talking and looked around, as if to make sure nobody else was too close. Satisfied, he looked straight ahead as we moved down the path. "So there was this area," he continued, "not far from the main campsite. Bunch of caves, not caves like tunnels or whatever you think, more like a pile of giant boulders overgrown with trees and moss and tiny spaces between the boulders. Crevices, some of them big enough to crawl through. Yellow signs up. Don't enter the..." Paul suddenly stopped talking. Up ahead, on the gravel path, a tall man with a scarf wrapped around his lower face strode toward us. He was heading straight for Paul, his boots crunching against the gravel, faster and faster until he strode right past us, as if we weren't even there. Paul looked back over his shoulder, waiting for a safe distance before continuing. "So we're out by these caves, and I was drinking, more than I should have been. And Holly, we're jumping from boulder to boulder, having fun, you know? But some of these rocks must have been over 40 feet tall, so we reached this one crevice, a bit wider than the rest. A sheer drop, About 30 feet down, getting thinner and thinner, right up to a slit of darkness below. Holly jumps it first. No problem. I jump it next, and my foot slips. He stopped walking for a moment, thinking back, remembering. Part of me wanted to cut him off, burst into accusations, but another part just wanted to know what happened. He trudged onward. So I tumbled over backward, head first into this crevice. My skull slams against the wall, and I black out. Come to about 20, maybe 30 seconds later, and I can barely breathe. My body's wedged between the boulders, my chest squeezed down on either side, my neck twisted and viced between the walls. I was stuck, upside down and looking straight into the darkness below. He stopped walking again, and his eyes drifted towards a nearby bench. "You mind if I sit?" I didn't respond. Paul strolled over and slumped down onto the bench, staring out over the pond, his cold blue eyes snapping back and forth over the water. I squatted down on the path in front of him, resting my elbows on my knees. A shimmering breeze crept over the pond, and a wet leaf stuck to the back of my head. I pulled it out and tossed it back into the wind. "So I'm stuck," said Paul, "upside down, head first, wedged between these two giant boulders. Blood rushing, ears ringing out, gasping in little sips of air as my vision blurs in and out. Holly's above, screaming down, asking if I'm okay, but I can't answer. I try speaking, but only muffled whimpers escaped. You ever had a nightmare where you scream for help and your voice falls back down into your throat?" Again, I didn't respond. "So Holly," Paul continued, "she can see my feet twitching down there, so she knows I'm still alive, and she yells down. She's going to get help. Tells me to try and stay awake. This was pre-cell phones, mind you. Though I doubt there'd been service out there anyway." He sniffed a little and wiped his nose with the back of his sleeve. "So now," he said, "I'm stuck out here, completely alone. Sun's still out, but it's getting dark. I'm in the shadows anyway. I can't really describe the terror of it, being stuck like that. Maybe you could imagine. It's like being stuck between two giant boulders, head first, upside down." He looked at me, expecting a laugh. I breathed out my nose. He looked away. "So, I'm there, doing everything I can to stay calm, keep sane, trying to focus on what little breath I had, making notes of my surroundings, green moss, gray rocks, shadowy crevice." He paused again, then looked directly at me. And that's when I saw him, or at least the faintest outline of him. My eyes were still adjusting, but down below, about 10 feet away, something was there. He went silent, his pupils dilated, as if he were back in the dark. I thought it was a giant spider at first. He looked away, embarrassed. Stupid, I know. He wiped his nose with the side of his hand. Then I thought it was like rocks, maybe optical illusion, All I could see was the faint shape of a body and the glint of what might be eyes, so maybe it was nothing. But as my vision adjusted, the whole picture came slowly into view. Still dark, still covered in shadow, but unmistakable. A man was down there, his body contorted and twisted, wedged between the rock like a trapdoor spider. Motionless, so damn still. Almost stiller than the stone, like a circus contortionist hid down there, waiting for me. Paul shook his head, like a chill went down his spine. His face filled with absolute nothing. Cold eyes, dead eyes, like shark eyes. Again, Paul looked straight at me. Maybe it's a body, I thought, trying to make sense of it. Maybe somebody fell down here before me. But then, Paul cleared his throat. His face was changing so slow, it was almost invisible. Like the sun moving. You can't see it actually move, but next thing you know, it's over there. His blank face shifting to a portrait of pure terror, like he was mirroring my inner emotion. My heart beat faster, thumping against the rock with every pump. My vision fading as all the blood in my body drained downward until I was about to pass out. I welcomed it. But then I heard him speak. Paul grimaced regretfully. Well, maybe heard's not the right word. He didn't open his mouth, and I didn't really hear anything. But I felt it, like something getting carved into my spine. This is all me being stuck between these two rocks, barely breathing. This is all everything ever was, and ever would be. Everything else, my life with Holly, fishing on a summer weekend, biking down the number 7. It's all nothing but a thin sheet that can and will be ripped away at any second. Paul shifted his weight. I can't explain why, but that unspoken message was so clear, like my entire life had been a dream, and I'd just woken up. There wasn't a shred of doubt in my mind, said Paul. Of course, that didn't make me feel any better. He chuckled bitterly. My panic shot into levels I didn't even think possible, the intruder's face changing to match. My vision getting dimmer and dimmer as more and more blood pushed into my head, until finally, I blacked out again. He paused, again looking around as if to make sure nobody else was within earshot. I woke up in an ambulance, hysterical, screaming and wailing about the man tucked between the rocks like a spider. Holly and the paramedics doing everything they could to calm me down, keep me from hurting myself. Finally, they ended up sedating me, and I dozed off until the hospital. He wiped his mouth. Concussion, minor cuts and bruises. He chuckled. All that. For that. Doctor told me it's common for concussed people to hallucinate, especially considering the lack of oxygen and me being upside down. Doctor told me about a fellow who almost drowned once, thought he saw the Easter Bunny in the water. I've always been scientifically minded, and that made sense to me. Brains play weird tricks. Hallucinations made more sense than some circus contortionist sneaking down there just to mess with me. Paul sighed, leaned forward, and rested his elbows on his knees. He looked at me, as if that was all he had left to say. I was about to speak when, "I'm guessing you found the tunnel, huh?" said Paul, nonchalantly. I didn't respond. I didn't know how. Paul nodded, pushed up from the bench, and walked down the path. I followed. "Yeah, I meant to tell you about that," said Paul, smiling grimly. "So, after I tried shooting the intruder, all those years back," he rubbed the knuckle stub where his pinky finger used to be, "things got bad. Really bad. The son of a bitch started taking steps forward every other day, sometimes every single day. Tried a lot of things to slow him down, but the only things that worked, the maze and the bunker door, Had some friends from the army help me with that. He shook his head. I was a medic in the war. Did I ever tell you that? Again, I didn't respond. I was doing everything in my power to stay calm. Of course, Holly and I were already on thin ice, and then I shot my own finger off. He smirked. Building an apocalypse maze bunker was the cherry on top. She took the kids and left, which, honestly, was fine by me. I didn't want my family around the intruder anyways, or around me for that matter. I was still painfully aware of the fact that I might just be completely insane. He stopped walking for a moment, looking around again. He continued, but her leaving, that really kicked me into gear. I forced myself to stop drinking. I started getting help, professional help, started taking meds, the right meds, and sure enough, things actually got better. The bunker door seemed to be keeping the intruder at bay. Sure, he was loud as hell, banging on it every night, but I wore earplugs, blasted white noise, and that was good enough. In a weird way, I was almost at peace with his being there. Paul sighed, breathing out fog as we walked along the path. So anyway, one night, maybe 6, 7 months after Holly left, I wake up and it's quiet. Dead quiet. No banging on the door, no screaming and howling from the basement. Just nothing. That silence filled me with a fear worse than anything I'd felt before, getting stuck between those boulders included. It terrified me, for a few reasons. First, it made me wonder what he was up to. Second, I'd gotten so used to the sound, I couldn't even sleep without it. In a twisted way, the intruder had given me a purpose, something to reckon with. And now he was gone. Paul looked up at the gray autumn skies, squinting as diffuse sunlight cast against his face. So a few weeks of nothing go by, and then, on a Sunday afternoon, Holly calls me up out of nowhere. I guess she heard through the grapevine that I was doing better, getting help, you know. She asked me how I was doing, asked me if I wanted to get coffee, maybe see a movie. Can you believe that? Just like how we met. She asked me out, back in those days. Smiling, Paul shook his head. I said, that'd be nice. Said next Tuesday be all right. Paul went silent, as if considering his next words carefully. Then I set the phone down and turned around, and there, set in the middle of the living room floor, a bottle of cognac. He scoffed. Unopened. Paul rubbed his forehead with the back of his thumb. I was sober for over half a year at this point, but I drank the whole thing. He glanced over at me, catching the judgment in my eyes. He looked back down the path. I drank it, 'cause it was there, said Paul, and then I get the brilliant idea to go check on the intruder. You know, just see what he'd been up to. I'd only ever tried to kill him once, and that backfired. Paul chuckled. But my shit-faced brain got some ideas in it, and I, drunk as hell, staggered downstairs, lurched open the bunker door, and tumbled inside. But there's nothing down there. No stack of boxes, no circus contortionist. Nothing. So I stagger farther, down through the maze all the way to the back corner, and there it is. A tunnel, dug into the basement floor, barely big enough to crawl through. Now, I assumed he was setting to wrap back up around into my house, so I lost my mind. I scrambled back upstairs, planning to come back down with a 9mm again and try God knows what. Paul started walking faster now. And then I go upstairs, and there he is, standing in the dead center of the living room, right where the bottle of cognac was, covering his face with his hands, like a kid trying to hide. And that's when I finally noticed it. On his left hand, the fifth finger was cut off short at the first knuckle. Paul held up his own hand. Everything suddenly clicked. He snapped his fingers with surprising loudness. I didn't know why, and I still don't know why, but he's connected to me. And in my head, the only way to stop it was to... He trailed off into somber silence. Still drunk as hell, and not thinking straight, I get into my old pickup truck and peel off down the hill, up the number 7, and I just drive. I drove past old houses, up through Merchant, and I kept going. I knew exactly where I was headed. Pedal to the floor the whole way there, finally feeling like everything made sense, like every single little thing in my entire life was building towards this. You know? I didn't respond. So I keep driving, faster and faster up towards the Balry Cliffs, whipping round every corner like a high-speed chase until I screech to a stop, nearly slam my face against the steering wheel. High beams cast over a long stretch of empty road, everything pointing towards the Balry Point lookout. He stopped walking and stared straight ahead, as if he was back in the truck, looking down a long stretch of road. I shifted into gear, slammed my foot into the pedal, and the tires spun out against the pavement a few seconds before they caught, and the truck lurched forward, hauling faster now, straight towards the cliff's edge. City lights below casting up into the night above. I shut my eyes. Any second now, I'd be sailing through the air, and... Again, he snapped his fingers. Everything crumbled into a crashing stop. My head snapped forward and smothered into a latex airbag. The stench of plastic and booze and gasoline. He paused for a moment, eyes flicking back and forth across the path ahead. Turns out the city installed stopping posts on the cliff edge, said Paul. Front bumper fallen off. I drove all the way back home. It was bright out by the time I got there. The intruder was gone. Paul started walking again. I latched up the bunker door and didn't go back down for years, the whole time expecting, any day now, he'd come pushing up through the floor, but it never happened. Paul shrugged. Look, I know it's a lot of talking, but all this to say, I can help you pass this off to somebody else. I shook my head, tired of the games, tired of the workarounds, the same way you pass this off to me. I mean, it wasn't intentional, but yes, more or less. Look, you don't need to decide right away. How far along is he? Top of the stairs, but still in the basement. Yes. Do you have a guest over? Yes. You barricaded the door? Yes. Good. Take some time to think about it. Even if he gets out of the basement, there are other ways to pass him off. Also, don't be freaked out if you see him upstairs, even with the door barricaded. He can do that, but he'll always set back to where he left off. All of this rambling still didn't explain his inexplicable knowledge of the coat rack. I almost brought it up, but stopped short. Maybe Mitch was right. Maybe the intruder really did get to Paul. Part of me wanted to take up Paul's offer, Part of me wanted to bunker barricade the basement door and pass off my problems to somebody else, move away and pretend none of this ever happened. But I didn't. I wish I could say it was out of some bedrock moral principle, but mainly, I refused Paul because I didn't trust him. I doubt Paul even trusted Paul. So far, I was adding pieces to an ever-evolving jigsaw puzzle. The more I learned, the less sense everything made. Part of me wondered if that was the point, if the chaos and confusion were part of the game. Maybe the intruder thought it was funny. Still, the main question remained, is there a way to stop the intruder without passing it off to somebody else? My car rattled as it droned down the number 7 highway. I was on my way back home from the meeting with Paul, and it was already dark out. I needed to get home and sleep. Then, a strange feeling came over me. A pressure in my forehead, not quite painful, but incredibly uncomfortable. Not a migraine either. It felt like a thin sheet of something suddenly appeared behind the skin of my forehead, pressing against my skull. I could almost feel my face pulling tighter. I rubbed my forehead with the back of my arm, and something big darted out onto the road in front of me. My foot slammed on the brakes, and my car swerved into a screeching drift. Everything outside blurred into a hazy streak and came to a crashing stop. My car slammed into a roadside barrier post, my head whiplashed sideways and cracked against the window. I blacked out and came back only seconds later. My headlights cast into an open field across the road. In the distance, a brown bear scrambled off into the dark. That's what I almost hit. I moved my arms to feel the side of my head. I moved my arm. I couldn't move. I tried turning my head. Nothing. I tried breathing. Nothing. I tried moving my eyes. With great effort, I glanced to the left, then to the right. "I know you're here." A strange but familiar voice echoed in the car. "You son of a bitch." Concussion, I told myself. I hit my head, and these are just the symptoms. I couldn't smell anything either, or hear anything other than the voice. I forced my eyes down to the steering wheel. It wasn't my steering wheel, and those weren't my hands gripped around it. This wasn't my body. I was trapped behind somebody else's eyes. A silent passenger, like that Malkovich movie. It felt like I was flattened out and pressed between forehead and skull, my senses fading in all the while. Sound first, the sound of torrential rain beating down against the windshield, howling wind as it gusted through the midnight fields. Then, the sound of breathing. Not my own breathing. The breathing of whoever I was trapped inside. Smell faded in next. Whiskey and vanilla-flavored smoke. One of the hands reached up and adjusted the rearview mirror. Cold blue eyes stared back at me. It was Paul. He looked younger, early 40s maybe. "Welcome back," he said, slurring his words, staring at himself through dilated pupils. He was talking directly to me. Paul coughed and rubbed his forehead with the back of his thumb. Pressure squeezed against me like a crushing vice. He smashed his forehead with the palm of his hand, and a jolt of pain shot through me. He hit himself again and again and again, each impact more painful than the last, until, finally, he stopped. Paul readjusted the mirror, shifted back into drive, and pulled onto the road. Frantic window wiper struggled to keep the rain at bay. I could feel everything now. The rumble of the highway, the taste of booze and tobacco, even blood. I was paralyzed. With what little control I had, I forced Paul's vision downward. He tapped the brakes and swerved into the opposite lane, then swerved back. Don't do that," he mumbled. And then another voice entered. "Just keep driving. You're almost done." It was Paul's voice again, but different, not slurred. "Keep driving. You're almost there." I was hearing his thoughts. Maybe hearing wasn't the right word. I was feeling them, as if the thoughts were my own. But they stuttered in and out like a bad radio signal. Up ahead on the side of the road, something bright green. I forced his eyes to look, and he swerved. The car slipped into a tailspin and sideswiped into something. 2 sickening thumps, and the car slammed bumper first into a roadside barrier post. Paul's head snapped forward into the steering wheel, and darkness. I was trapped behind somebody else's eyes now. I could feel their thoughts, but this was no ordinary thought stream. It was a dripping fractal of swarming thought streams all battling for control. Random memories jumped out from a subconscious mess, like fish climbing a waterfall. Coat rack, 1 step, idiot, stupid idiot. This was a soul forever damned to an eternity of paralyzed chaos and suffering. This was the intruder. I knew it. I could feel their feet now, pressed against scratchy carpet. They took 1 step forward, then another and another. 7 quick steps downward until they tumbled into the wall. Silence. Then, as if puppeteered from above, they slid up the wall and rose to standing, and I snapped into another person, walking down my neighborhood street. "We'd sell them to the neighbors," said a familiar voice. "Pine cones, 5 cents apiece." It was Mitch. He looked to his side, and there, about 6 feet away, I stood. Mitch shook his head, and a chill went down his spine. I suddenly stood in front of my own front door, looking up at myself. "I've seen enough of those for a while," Howie's voice echoed as he rubbed his forehead with the back of his thumb. Darkness. "I couldn't even think straight," Paul's voice echoed. "Leaving, coat rack, charm, coat rack, filament," the intruder's voice echoed. Daylight. I stood outside the roadside diner, trapped behind Paul's eyes as he climbed onto a red Kawasaki motorcycle and looked back towards the diner. Through the window, I stared at me. Darkness. Now I shuffled through random memories. Upside down, barely breathing, stuck between 2 boulders. In the darkness below me, the faintest shape of a person, impossibly tucked between the rocks like a coiled-up viper. The glint of dead eyes. Darkness. A backyard shed cluttered with junk. Hands frantically wrapped wire around the shattered remnants of a coat rack. Darkness. Crawling through a tunnel, a dirt ceiling scraped against my back. Darkness. "I'm sorry. Oh, God." Paul's voice. I stepped out of a truck. Headlights cut through the night, and freezing rain showered down. Red and guts mixed with water on the pavement, and a bloody streak led up the road to a body 50 feet away. Crawling. Darkness. The rhythmic thud of a hammer clanging against nails. I stood at the bottom of the basement steps, staring at a closed door. Paralyzed. Darkness. A hospital bed in a bedroom, military medical equipment scattered everywhere. Darkness. A blaring truck horn. I finally snapped back to the present. Inches from the front of my car, a semi-truck sped by. I was parked on the highway shoulder at a 90-degree angle. The sun was rising. I was back in the present, or at least that's what I assumed. I looked at my hands. My hands. I clenched them shut and opened them. I rubbed my forehead with the back of my thumb, pulled onto the highway, and drove. I had no idea what the hell just happened. You can leave the house, but never sleep anywhere else. As I drove down the highway, theories buzzed through my head like a swarm of locusts. Did Paul kill Zach in a drunk driving accident? Did Paul wire up the shattered coat rack, crawl through the tunnel, and set it back in my house? Was Paul a servant of the intruder? Was I becoming a servant of the intruder? After my vision, at least a few things made more sense. Not only was the intruder connected to its victims, the intruder's victims were connected to each other. Maybe it was some kind of hive mind. Maybe it was turning people into intruders themselves. At this point, it seemed like anything was possible. And the way Paul's eyes moved outside the diner all those days ago, like somebody had jumped into his head, taken a quick look around, then jumped back out again. Now I knew that it was me. I'm the one who jumped into Paul's head. The nightmare logic, or everything, made me nauseous, like a carnival ride with no exits. A paradox web of chaos and madness, with answers always hiding one step out of reach. Above all was another question. Exactly who was the supposed old friend in Paul's house, the person he owed a favor, the person he was taking care of? Was it my childhood friend, Zach? During my sporadic visions, I saw a green bike through Paul's eyes, the exact same bike my friend Zach was riding when he supposedly died. Did Paul hit him all those years ago? Did he find Zach barely alive on the side of the road and bring him back home? Was he keeping him alive to this day with his medical equipment and military training? Did the timelines even match up? It was possible, but crazy even to consider. What are the chances? Paul happening to live across the street from me all these years ago. Was the intruder orchestrating everything from the start? Perhaps this entity had been involved in my life far longer than the last few weeks. Now that I thought about it, there was a vague familiarity about everything, almost like déjà vu. Like that feeling one gets around death. You'll know it if you've ever survived a bad car accident or faced something potentially terminal. You see part of the abyss. You finally realize, maybe for the first time, that at some point, you won't exist anymore. You barely existed to begin with. In the words of Max Schumacher from Network, death becomes a perceptible thing with definable features. Before all this, I never really feared death. There were times I welcomed it. That's easy to say when it's sitting off in the distance, caged behind bars. But when the end of everything is standing just 10 feet away, looking you in the eyes. My phone started buzzing in a cup holder, slowly spinning around as the screen lit up. I pulled into the parking lot of a nearby gas station, Buster's Better Gas. I parked the car, grabbed my phone, and called the missed number back. "Bradley?" said the voice on the other end. "Brandon." "Oh, Brandon, though." It was Howie, of course. "What's up?" I said. Not much. Just, checking to see if you're okay. Haven't seen you in a while. Yeah, I'm fine. Just been running some errands. Oh, you weren't here last night? No. Huh? What? Well, somebody tore down your art thing. Art thing? I'd already forgotten about my excuse for the barricaded door. The basement door, he said. Whole thing's gone. Frame too. Oh, I said, trying to sound calm. Yeah, I, paid some guys to take it out. I lied. In the middle of the night? Yeah, I guess so, if that's when they showed up. I went to bed and the door was there, and I woke up and the door was gone. I guess they were quiet, I said, the lie growing more absurd by the second. Yeah, I'm a light sleeper too, he chuckled. Anyways, Howie continued, I'm just calling to ask if it's cool I crash a few more weeks. I'll pay you rent once I get the money. Yeah, Howie, don't worry about it, I said. That's it? Yeah. See you, Brandon. Thanks again. It really means a lot, man. I hung up. Fantastic. Now the basement door was gone. In all the confusion, I still hadn't realized my violation of Rule 8. You can leave the house, but never sleep anywhere else. My thoughts drifted back to Mitch. He knew a lot more than he was letting on. I still didn't trust him, but I trusted him more than Paul. Low bar, I know. I pulled out my phone and dialed his number. 5 tones rang out, straight to voicemail. Mailbox full. I called again. Same thing. I called again. 3 tones rang out, then silence. He cut the call short. Mitch was ignoring me. I tucked my phone away and stepped out into the parking lot. Inside the gas station, I bought a cheap burner phone and a pack of smokes. Sure, I quit a few months back, but I needed something to calm my nerves. Besides, I'd quit again after this pack. Stop judging me. Back in my car, I lit up a dart and called Mitch on the burner phone. He wouldn't recognize the number this way. I hated being stalkerish, but my life literally depended on it. 3 tones rang out, and Mitch answered. Hello? Mitch, don't hang up. Silence. And then, what do you want? I'm sorry I spoke with your... I stopped myself from saying Dad. With the neighbor. What do you want? Said Mitch, losing patience. I just need to talk one more time. In person. I don't know. He sighed. I've already said too much. Just keep following the rules. Ignore everything else. Mitch, please. I'm literally losing my mind here. Just one more talk. What do you tell the neighbor? Barely anything. I just said... Mitch interrupted. You know what? Never mind. Mitch gave me his address on Baker Street and told me to ring when I get there. Then he ended the call. Mitch lived about 40 minutes away in a small town off the interstate. One of those towns where Main Street's nothing but a graveyard of pre-Walmart family shops. Survival of the cheapest. I pulled up to an old and gray concrete apartment building that looked straight out of Soviet Russia. This was the place. Lugging my crutches out of the back seat, I climbed out of the car and shut the door. Thanks to crashing into the roadside barrier, a heavy indent was scraped into the side of my car. Great. I double-checked my pockets. Phone, check. Switchblade, check. I brought my chrome switchblade everywhere now, just in case. It was already dark out. The days were getting shorter. The air was cold, and my breath was foggy. I crutched up to the building and rung in Mitch's room number. Rubbing my freezing hands together, I waited. The door buzzed open. Mitch's place looked early 70s to me. Open design, cut down the middle, half kitchen, half living room. Between them, a bar with rickety stools. Mitch looked a little better than the last time I saw him. Still tired, though. "Hey, Mitch," I said, forcing a smile. Silent, Mitch stood about 6 feet away. He half smiled, strode back into the kitchen, and started scrubbing dishes in the sink. I took off my coat and pulled the door shut behind me. Mitch scraped grime off a cast-iron frying pan, his back turned to me. I walked up to the edge of the kitchen and looked around. His place was tidy, like a hotel room. "What'd the neighbor tell you?" said Mitch, referring to his father. "A lot." "You believe him?" "I don't know." Mitch sighed, tossed the dishes down, and turned off the sink. Shaking water off his hands, he turned around and leaned back against the countertop. "So, what do you want from me?" he said, wiping his hands onto his shirt. "I have some questions," I said. "Some" was an understatement. "Okay. Shoot." I didn't know where to start. Last night, I almost ran into a bear, swerved, hit my head on the window, almost blacked out, and then you snapped into other people's minds, saw things from the past, maybe even the future," said Mitch, crossing his arms. I looked at him, surprised. "Yeah, I mean more than that, but..." Mitch shook his head as if to say, "I expected as much." "What does it mean?" I said. "Look, what you're doing right now, you being here, this whole rabbit hole of finding the truth, it's not healthy. The more obsessed you get, the more crazy you become. The crazier you are, the easier it is to control you." "Control me?" Mitch ignored the question. "Stop expecting some priest or medium to come in and explain what's going on. Nobody's going to show up and tell you how this thing spawned from an ancient curse or some other bullshit, and the only way to kill it is to sacrifice a dog or pray to Jesus," he said mockingly. "That's not what this is. You can't reason with something that doesn't think. The only thing you can do is keep following the rules and put off more time between now and..." He trailed into morbid silence. "If you think this is going to end all tied up with a neat little bow, you're going to end up severely traumatized." As if I wasn't already. Mitch looked up at the ceiling, considering his next words carefully. "There's a good reason I've been so vague about everything. The more involved you are, the more you know, the more you share, the more you search for answers, the more it slithers into your life, into your thoughts, your dreams, everything." Mitch rubbed his jaw. "I barely escaped it myself," he said, looking across the room, staring at the door behind me. I glanced back over my shoulder. There was a floor-length mirror on the door, partially obscured by my coat. "After it took my dad," Mitch continued, "I almost got pulled in. I started researching, investigating. That's when the vision started, like what happened with you in the car. The intruder feeds you these little snippets of random moments. All of them feel like they might be connected, like they should have a reason, and maybe they do. But just because something has a reason doesn't mean it's a good one." "What's going to happen to me?" I said. "It's already happening," said Mitch. "You're becoming a servant of the Tulpa or whatever it is. The worst part is you'll still feel and control, but you won't be. Soon enough, you'll start breaking into people's houses at night, leaving coat racks in the basements, just like my dad. Maybe you've already done it, and you forgot. Then you'll be telling people to not worry about it, telling them to work on themselves. telling them there's no such thing as ghosts. How do you know all this? I don't. It's all theory. At the end of the day, who the hell knows anything about anything? Who knows what Tulpa wants? Maybe it feeds off the chaos. Maybe it's working towards something bigger. I don't know. I don't want to. How did Paul really die? Mitch grit his teeth. Then he just stared at me, shaking his head, eyes filled with "go to hell, you really want to know?" "When I was a kid," he said, "after Mom took us and moved out, a few years went by, and Dad started getting his life together. Stopped drinking, stopped leaving creepy notes in people's shoes, got on some good meds, etc. So Mom, after some gentle pushing from my sister, calls him up, asks him out for coffee." Mitch went silent, eyes flicking back and forth across the wall behind me. "That same night, after the phone call, Dad gets shit-faced, drives up to the Balry Cliffs. Same lookout he and Mom used to go stargazing at." Mitch grimaced. "So, he drives full speed towards the cliff's edge and slams bumper first into a barrier post." He shook his head. "Believe it or not, he wasn't the first person to drive a car off the Balry Cliffs. Said he put up the post a few months prior." Mitch pressed his tongue into the side of his cheek, thinking. "So, anyways, Dad's still drunk as hell, passed out, face in the airbag." Mitch pushed off from the counter, stepped over to the table, pulled out a chair, and sat down. "Gas leak catches fire. Dad burns alive." Mitch tapped his knuckles against the table a few times. "Police said he was out cold. Didn't feel a thing. But I knew enough to know that wasn't true. Saw a photo of the corpse on accident. Mouth wide open." Mitch opened his own mouth to show. "I'm no expert, but people don't generally scream when they're asleep." Mitch slapped the table and ran his hand back and forth a couple times. "So, we make arrangements to sell Dad's house. It's the weekend, we're moving stuff out, and then..." He paused, looking directly at me. "There comes Dad, riding a brand new motorcycle. He's all confused too, what we're doing with his stuff, you know?" Mitch breathed out his nose. "Said he was on a trip out of county. Course Mom loses her mind. Hell, we all lose our minds. Dad's back from the grave and all." Mitch looked away, his eyes watering slightly now. He stamped his foot against the laminate flooring. "The coroner's report. The police. It's like none of it even happened. Mom was hysterical, screaming at the police station saying they were trying to gaslight us. They weren't. Documents never existed, at least not anymore. State almost took us away from her for insanity, so she stopped talking about it. We all did. Telling people you believe in ghosts lands you in an awkward conversation. Telling people your dad is back from the dead lands you in a psych ward." He scoffed. "The thing that really messed with me, aside from the obvious, was his hands." Mitch held up his hands and spread his fingers. 10 fingers, including the one he shot off in the basement. Mitch looked at me again. "This thing bent reality over us, like a wire, like it bumped us into a parallel world or something." Mitch looked away again, staring at the kitchen cupboards as he spoke. "Dad, or whatever replaced him, kept trying to reconnect with us, but we wouldn't have it. Moved cross-country, cut off all ties." Mitch sighed. "Things got a little better after that. Distance helped, especially back then." He trailed off into silence. "What made you come back?" I don't know. Guilt, maybe. Morbid curiosity. Why the notes? I started asking around his neighborhood, low profile, if people had seen anything, heard anything, about my dad. Everyone there was so damn weird and similar. Weird tics like... Mitch rubbed his forehead with the back of his thumb to show people unable to remember basic words. Their eyes lighting up randomly and looking around as if somebody else was in there. Same stuff I noticed with my dad. Like the thing from his basement was spreading, taking over the whole neighborhood like a virus, he said, shifting his weight slightly. How'd you figure out the rules? I didn't. Not fully. Those were just things that seemed to slow it down, at least in my dad's case. Before we left him, I found it all scribbled up on a napkin. Dad, for all his flaws, he's really smart, logical. He would have tested things out, experimented, figured out exactly what that entity reacts to, doesn't react to, etc. So all of this, the more you know, the more he controls you. Maybe. It's only a theory. And I'm basically screwed no matter what I do. Mitch stepped up from the table, strode over to the kitchen sink, and stared out at a brick wall view. He sighed. Look, Brandon, I should have been more honest with you before, but you want to know the truth, right? Yes. This has been over and done with from the start. I didn't respond. Ever since you snapped the coat rack in half, he continued, it was game over. I blinked. He looked back at me over his shoulder. I didn't tell you that because I didn't want you to panic. The more calm you are, the more sane you are, the longer it takes for this thing to get a hold of you. Get a hold of me. You're becoming part of it now. Just like my dad, just like the neighbors. And there's nothing I can do to stop it. Mitch shook his head and looked back out the window. You should leave, he said, posture slumped as he set his hands onto the countertop. But I still don't leave, he snapped, his voice booming with surprising loudness. I shook my head, crutched back for the door, pulled on my coat, and wrapped my hand around the doorknob. Thanks for the help, I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. I turned the knob. It was locked. Weird. I unlocked it and tried again. Still locked. Mitch? I said, looking at him in the mirror on the door. Mitch, back turned, now stood in the center of the kitchen with pin-straight posture, hands covering his face, like somebody playing peekaboo. Mitch? I said, looking back over my shoulder. Suddenly, the room shifted darker, but the lights didn't go out. Like a camera shifting aperture, everything dimmed into a slow-motion nightmare. Mitch's left hand shot straight up into the air, as if being pulled from above. Then his right hand, both hands straight up in the air, standing on his tiptoes like a cursed dancer. I watched in wide-eyed horror, paralyzed. Suddenly his arms dropped to his sides like an invisible straitjacket wrapped around him. He stood there, motionless. Then he burst into coughing, hunched over and staggered towards the sink, rubbing his forehead as he went. You okay? I said, taking a few careful steps forward. He threw a hand up, motioning me to stay back. I did. But his desperate wheezing and coughs only grew worse, like he was choking. He thumped his chest until finally, something flew out of his mouth and plopped into the dirty sink water. I'm okay, he gasped. I'm okay. I glanced back towards the door. Mitch, back still turned to me, plunged a hand into the soapy water, fishing around for whatever came out of his throat. He froze, and his eyebrows raised. Slowly, he lifted something out of the water. It was an object about the size of a chapstick, but I couldn't tell what it was from this distance. "What the hell?" Mitch whispered. His hand suddenly swung to his sides again. The object flew to the floor, slid across the kitchen, and slowed to a stop in front of me. It was a dismembered finger. What the hell was right? Mitch staggered back from the sink 7 quick steps. He straightened up into pin-straight posture again, tried to speak, but only gargled whimpers escaped, like he was being suffocated. I stepped backwards to the door, eyes darting around the room for another escape. There was no balcony, but I was too many floors up for that anyways. "What the hell?" Mitch screamed. "What the—" His voice cut off into a choking mess. Suddenly, his throat swelled up like something was pushing on it from the inside out. His head snapped back, forcing him to look straight up at the ceiling. And then something pushed out from his mouth. Several somethings, long and wriggling, like worms. Fingers. Long fingers with extra joints slid out from his mouth and wrapped around his face. Gaunt hands, unnaturally large, squeezed together as they wriggled their way out of his mouth. Pig-colored skin, like a face hugger. The same hands I saw wrapped around the coat rack all those nights ago, pulling his mouth wider and wider until it started ripping at the corners of the lips. Enough was enough. I spun around and shouldered into the door, using all my weight to crash into it again and again, all the while witnessing the horrific sight behind me reflected on the door mirror. Hidden by shadows, something tall and fetus-like was climbing out of Mitch's body, naked and